All right, welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon for some of you that may be virtual. Thank you for joining today's Stakeholder Input Forum on the Modernization of Standards, Processes, and Procedures Task Force's draft recommendations. I'm Kristen Awanechko, NERC's Director of Membership Engagement. I will be your MC for the day. Initially, I want to call everyone's attention to NERC's antitrust compliance guidelines. It is NERC's policy and practice to obey antitrust laws and avoid all conduct that unreasonably restrains competition. If there are any questions, please contact our General Counsel, Sonia Hosha. Also be advised, the forum is public and notice was posted on the NERC website and publicly announced, and the listening audience and participants may include members of the press, representatives of various governmental authorities, and of course, the expected participation of many industry stakeholders. We are recording this session and plan to post the session on the NERC website in the coming weeks. And with that, we will go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about the agenda and the objectives. Next slide. So first off, just a short recap of where the task force has been. As you hopefully know, the NERC board established the task force at its February meeting of this year to develop recommendations for modernizing NERC's process and keep up with the fast emerging risks to the grid. The recommendations are due to the board, the NERC board, this coming February. And the task force has been hard at work developing these recommendations throughout the year, has been engaging industry throughout the process, issued a survey publicly back in June, received a lot of feedback there. From that, developed a white paper that was released back in July with potential improvement opportunities in the areas of standard initiation, standard drafting, and balloting. Based on the feedback that stakeholders provided on that white paper, the task force recently posted draft recommendations, as you all know, recently for a written comment period. That comment period closed earlier this week. And then we're here today for an additional opportunity for stakeholders to provide feedback and engage with the task force directly around the comments that you all have on the draft recommendations. We do have several task force members in the room with us today that will help and provide some context and engage in the conversations. And really the primary purpose for today is to listen to stakeholders, understand the concerns and feedback so the task force can consider all of that as they work to develop the final recommendations. As we do engage in the discussions today, the virtual audience can submit comments or questions through either the Q&A panel in WebEx or to raise your virtual hand and we will unmute you. So for the agenda for today, we will start with a short overview of the quantitative analysis from the stakeholder feedback that came in on that comment period that closed earlier this week, and then move into conversations around 6 themes, which I'll mention in just a moment, that arose from that feedback. We will break for lunch at noon for a 45-minute lunch, and then and continue the conversations, and then of course do just a closeout. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the quantitative feedback. Thank you, of course, to everybody who submitted comments on the draft recommendations. We received a total of 69 responses spread out across several of the NERC membership sectors. Won't spend a lot of time reading through this slide, but do know that your feedback is appreciated, and just thank you. So for the next several slides, we'll just briefly touch on what the raw data was really showing us in the questions that came through. So on the next slide, let's talk about the standard initiation questions. The raw data for the questions that were asked around standard initiation showed that stakeholders are generally uncomfortable with the proposed composition of the recommended risk subcommittee, but generally agree with the handoff timing from the RSTC to the risk subcommittee. There was a fairly even split around the proposed governance structure of the risk subcommittee, whether it reports to a board or as a subset of, or as a subcommittee of the risk. But overall, stakeholders are mostly supportive of the initiation recommendation. So certainly some questions and concerns around some specifics, but overall supportive of the recommendations as a whole. So next slide, we will talk a little bit about drafting. and the raw data there shows a fairly split perspective on the stakeholder SME panel recommendations, the composition and what they do and what their role is. There is general support for the recommendations around the getting feedback and engagement from the comment periods and the straw polls early on and throughout the process. And really just overall with the drafting recommendations, generally split about the recommendations overall with standard drafting. Next up, balloting on the next slide. So for the balloting questions, stakeholders are mostly supportive of the changes to the balloting process recommendations. So removing that early ballot pool formation, some of the changes that were recommended around removing some of the restrictions around who can vote on behalf of an organization. We did hear that there was a lot of angst or a lot of concern around the attestation, so mostly unsupportive of the attestation consideration that the task force put out there, and certainly split on the recommendations put out around the registered ballot body segment structure. So overall, finding that stakeholders are generally mixed about the balloting recommendations as a whole. So next slide, just a couple of more here. So we had two additional questions, one around whether there were ample opportunities for industry participation throughout the recommended process. And there is general agreement that there are certainly recommendations to provide ample opportunities for stakeholder input. And then around the fast track, mostly we did hear support or agreement with having a fast track process for FERC directives and urgent NERC board initiatives. So overall, with all of these questions, certainly several suggestions or recommendations to boost overall support for the direction that the task force is heading, and we'll certainly look forward to hearing more about that today. So if we go to the next slide, based on the feedback that the task force has received so far through both the comment period, various engagement efforts that the task force has been conducting, we've identified 6 themes that we're going to focus on for today's input forum. Those themes are feedback and engagement, risk subcommittee, stakeholder SME panel, balloting process, the registered ballot body structure, and then implementation. The way that we'll structure today's session is we will go theme by theme. And for each one of them, I'll just do a very brief introduction, then turn to one of the task force members that is here in the room to provide some brief additional context around the recommendations and what the task force was thinking as they developed those recommendations. And then we'll open the floor to attendees to provide additional comments, clarify any comments you may have submitted written, or ask any clarifying questions and have a conversation around that. Conversations today are really intended to be a dialogue with an emphasis on stakeholder input. We're not planning to fine tune any of the recommendations here. The task force just wants to understand at this point where the recommendations or where the comments are coming from and what your perspectives are. And then we'll take the comments and feedback from these forums and the written comment period and all of the other engagement that the task force is doing to develop final recommendations and consider those as it develops the final recommendations to bring to the board. And then finally, we will get to as many questions and comments as possible, but we do want to ensure that we get to each topic, so we may need to cut some of the conversations short, not because we don't want to hear what you have to say, but we just want to make sure we give each of the topics a fair conversation today. So if we do have time at the end, we can certainly circle back to any conversations we may have to cut short. And also just always encourage everybody to reach out directly to task force members to discuss your comments, or even at any point, you can always email mspp@nerc.net, and we will ensure those comments get passed through to the task force. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the dialogue, and we will start off with feedback and engagement. So through the stakeholder feedback that we've heard so far, there seems to be general agreement that there are opportunities for stakeholder feedback in the recommendations, but some clarifications have been requested around the various timelines and methods of participation in each of the steps. What's formal versus informal? When is feedback required versus at the discretion of a certain group? So with that, I'm going to turn to Matt Holtz to give a little bit of context from the task force's perspective, and then we'll open up for comments.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, Matt Holtz. So starting off with just some themes of feedback that we've received from you all, stakeholders in the process, but also consistent with our guiding principles that we had, when we stood up the task force, and things that we wanted to focus on as we went down this path. So really focus on transparency, representation, inclusion, but then also participation, that it's open to the industry, all stakeholders, there's the ability to participate, but on a timeline that's manageable to avoid roadblocks and log jams that have been experienced in the past, and try to make that a little more efficient. So the transparency side, we focused on trying to have the process transparent from the beginning. So some of the themes you may have seen in the proposal that was posted, that the standards initiation requests are open to all stakeholders. So similar to current process, that was maintained going forward. So anyone that's engaged and interested can submit a standards initiation request. Through the process, there's going to be a prioritization process, so a forum for stakeholders to come and participate in the overall review of initiation requests, prioritization process. That's all going to be open, and we encourage participation. But then also, we came up with this concept of the term sheet, right? So nothing that's new to the business, right? But it's trying to incorporate the concept of a term sheet in with the standards process that gives it more clarity for everyone engaged, but then also for stakeholders, that you all can follow it and understand what is going into the drafting and what to expect on the back end. And also looking at increasing the number of touch points in between, right, to give feedback. So a lot of those examples on solutions that we focused on run through all the themes here that I teed up before. But again, representation. Again, anyone can submit the initiation request. The balloting, that maintaining that all entities in the segments have a vote. You can still participate in the commenting period, either individually or as groups. As one theme that was missing, I guess, from the proposal and feedback that we got right away. I know I was at a session at CERC where we got the feedback of, hey, you have this concept of, if we want to vote, we have to be participating in the commenting period. But what if I'm commenting as part of a group? So it was a great catch. Brought it back to the group, and the intent is that whether you're submitting comments as an individual company or part of a industry group, that we're able to capture your participation and carry that through to the balloting. And again, participation. You hopefully saw the theme that we intended to get engagement early. So again, the initiation requests, the biannual sessions, right? The open sessions where we talk about the initiation requests, the prioritization process, term sheets, all open, all chances to give feedback. And even as part of the standards drafting process, having straw polls as part of the solutions, a I forget the concept, the term, but the straw polls confirmation ballot. Thank you. Confirmation ballot, right? That before it goes to the official balloting, there's the ability to make your position known before we get to that place. But it's all in the means of trying to, avoid the process, the time associated with the balloting process and the feedback and all that. That we want to get that early and capture that as part, early on, once it goes into the term sheets and the drafting, that once it goes through the process, that hopefully it's in a position that, the balloting is more of a administrative formalization process as opposed to, your first attempt to give feedback. So that's it for the themes. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Matt. So at this point, I want to open it up to any comments from attendees around the feedback and engagement opportunities and recommendations that the task force has put out. Again, if you want to clarify any or provide additional context around any of the comments that you may have already submitted, or any perspectives that you may have. So for those in the room, if you just want to put your tent up, if you would like to make a comment, and for those on the phone, feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A panel or raise your hand and we will unmute you. John Ray, go ahead.
I'll get us started. First off, just want to say thank you for all the feedback and engagement that we've had throughout this process. And I think that we have a much better product today than when we started, which is what we expected to find as we moved along. And I think carrying that through as we build this new process together, it's really the key element is making sure that we are checking and adjusting along the way. We're getting, stakeholder engagement throughout the process. We have the opportunity to make sure sectors are able to share their views in a way that kind of makes sense. And so as we work through continuing to kind of build out, how this actually works, I think that those will be the kind of the keystones in terms of what we want to set as our goals along the way. So I appreciate the work that the group has done. I definitely appreciate the feedback that they've taken, and that everyone around this table and across the country has provided. I guess across the continent, I should say, has provided along the way. And just wanted to say thank you for these opportunities.
All right, thank you, John. Any other comments? So we do have one in the Q&A chat here that sort of straddles a bit across commenting, but then into balloting. So the question is, I think I'm understanding this correctly. Will the person who is commenting throughout the process have to be the individual that is in the registered ballot body?
It's organization specific as opposed to the person at that entity that's submitting the ballot.
Thank you, Matt. All right, any other comments? Or Srinivas, please go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide some comments here. My organization did submit some comments, and I want to echo what John said earlier. A huge thank you to the task force in taking all the feedback from across the continent. Obviously, you guys have given us a lot more opportunity to provide feedback, be engaged, whether it's through written or through other means. So we really appreciated that fact that we had all that opportunity, access to task force members, even emailing them some questions at some point when we had to. And so we appreciate that. That was a little bit new to me. That didn't exist previously, or at least in my opinion. I thought it didn't, maybe it did, but really appreciated all that engagement. The one question I had as I looked through the earlier slides, Kristen, when you presented the statistics, did you say we got like 69 or 70 sets of comments? I was just wondering, does the task force think that's enough comments that you guys have seen, or do we need more? because it seems like I don't know how many people are in the whole ballot body, and how does that compare to how many people actually responded, or do we need to have more time to get some more comments, was the only question I had. Initial question, and I'm sure as we go through, I'll have some more. Thanks.
Yeah. And I won't speak on behalf of the task force on whether that's enough, but one thing that I will just clarify or note that within those 69 responses, there were a number of trade organizations that would have, coordinated with their members. And I believe there were about 10, if I have the number right, 10 trade organizations represented within those responses.
I think if I remember right, I think there was a good representation of trade organizations across the sectors too, right? Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we've got a couple more comments or questions coming in through the Q&A here online. So first one, what counts as, or what is intended to count as development participation? Can someone essentially submit a minor comment early on in the process and then still be eligible to vote later? So is there a threshold for what constitutes a comment that makes it eligible for balloting?
Wasn't a level of detail that we got into yet as a task force. I know there's some details that still has to be worked out, I think, once you get to the implementation phase. So, other task force members, if you want to opine, but I'm not sure that would be a level of detail we would get into in the final proposal, but it certainly is something that will need to be defined at some point. I see nodding of heads. So, okay.
Might be worth, have a little bit of back and forth, right? What is the concern, right? I think that the thought process from the task force, and I'm not speaking for the task force members, they can speak for themselves, is that, it's not, we want to avoid having people come at the very end without having participated. What is meaningful participation ahead of time? It could take various forms, right? What is the concern behind this question that will allow us to maybe provide the right level of detail or come up with something that actually works, right? Because we certainly don't need plain interventions like you have in proceedings at FERC that just say, I'm here. That's probably not what we're looking for. But then, in between that and a fulsome set of comments, what is the right level? So I think part of the, I guess what I'm interested in getting back from industry and the public in general is, where is that coming from? What would be helpful in terms of, additional detail?
That is a great point. It reminds me of discussions we have had as a task force that, we are asking for a lot of work upfront from everyone, stakeholders, to help mold this. And we certainly want to avoid folks showing up at the 11th hour and, throwing the monkey wrench in it. So.
I just wanted to add this is Joe Fina. From the task force perspective, I think we have said that an individual comment or joint comments would be fine. We have not defined what comments are. So I think we're leaving a lot of room there of flexibility to stakeholders to participate in various different ways. In the implementation of phase, I don't think that we would be opposed in putting some more, parameters around that. But at least at this point, from a conceptual level, that's kind of where we landed, I think.
And then we do, and John, I see that your tent is up. We do have Todd Lucas, the task force vice chair, wants to make a comment on this question as well. So Todd, would you like to go? And then we'll turn to John.
Hey, Kristen, can y'all hear me? Just a sound check.
Yes.
I'm probably piling on a little bit, but I think the real intent here is to make sure the people that are engaged early on, that are assisting in molding the standard, that they're the ones that vote. So I think Joe's right. We have talked about, for those that are working through the trades to submit comments, that we need a mechanism to capture all the people involved in that. Certainly, we expect to have straw polls, and I think that's a really good, and those are important because those are helping us gauge, are we ready to really go to a ballot? So the intent is really not to exclude anybody that has been engaged. So the task force is wide open to how do we ensure we capture everyone that has been engaged in helping mold the standard. That's really all we're after. So any more thoughts we hear from the industry on kind of avenues we haven't thought about, we need to incorporate those. But even some of this may get caught up in the implementation. We're going to figure out along the way, we probably forgot about something and we need to add another component to make sure the appropriate people are included in the ballot pool.
Thank you, Todd. And we did have just a flurry of tents pop up in the room here. So we'll start off with John. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kristen. So just real quickly, as I was thinking through the kind of how this all will play out, there are times when well-meaning people can disagree on what the words mean. And so someone might believe they are engaged or don't need to be engaged because they like the way the standard's going and everything makes sense, until they find out they had a misunderstanding of how an element was being presented. We've had that situation, with the ride-through elements. We thought we understood what the rules were talking about, and then all of a sudden we get partially, fairly long way into the process, and then realized, oh no, we're not in agreement in what the words necessarily mean. So I guess my point is making sure that we don't want to go to zero engagement counts, but we should make sure that it's not such a robust requirement that kind of a scenario might eliminate someone with really good feedback to be able to participate in the process later on. Just thought.
Thank you, John. And I did not see which order these tents went up. So we'll, Srinivas, why don't you go ahead?
No, thanks, John, for bringing it up. I was gonna say that too, because you could know that, or you could be following the standards process and be okay with it until at the last minute when you thought really something that affected your company changed. The other aspect that I could think of in terms of engagement, I think right now, if you vote no on a standard and don't actually have any comments in there, those are not counted, correct? I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but if my comment is, hey, I'm not ready with all my comments yet in the engagement period because I'm still working with some of my other peers on developing some of those comments, there's no way right now for me in the process to say I can submit my comments at a later stage. So I think a good trade-off might be when you do the non-binding poll or straw poll, whatever that is, right? At that point, maybe look at people who actually have submitted comments. And to me, that's a good point where you say, hey, if you agree with this, say you agree with this, or if you don't, tell me what your concerns are, right? I think that would be a good point, a good way to engage. I think maybe the question is alluding to, if I don't submit any comments, am I engaged? Probably not. That would be my guess, but that's something to think about. And usually when speaking from some of the smaller IBR type community, they may not have all the resources to put together comments for every standard that's being developed. So they kind of rely on some of their peer groups or trade organizations like you talked about. And sometimes those common positions are hard to flesh out because there's a lot of members in there and some people agree with some stuff, some people don't. And so it's easy for someone to say, okay, I agree with their comments, but then eventually you find out once you start working with your SMEs that you're not, right? That's the other scenario I could think of, just as a couple examples.
Thank you, Srinivas. So in the interest of time, we'll go to Tino and then Scott and then move to the next topic. And again, if we've got time later, we can pick this up. But Tino, please go ahead.
So, yeah, I just, the thought when with seeing this part of the recommendation was, I get, we certainly want to have meaningful participation and get good comments, and we don't want it ultimately to be derailed. But it does give me some concern that we might go down the path of having judgment or on the quality of a comment, and that we get into kind of an administrative thing that's been referenced here of just offering up something, but then some comments may be acceptable and exactly how you can really establish what the criteria is for that. So that's just my thought.
Thank you, Tino. Scott?
Yeah, I think that the trick here is trying to figure out how to get useful participation in this process and don't use it as a placeholder. Someone's looking at a Facebook stream and they put their period on there and then they're on there forever. We don't want to have that. So, but then at the same time, you want to make sure that if someone is watching it, planning to engage, but they aren't necessarily there yet, you don't want to exclude them by virtue of them not saying something in version 1 or however you go. We've set this thing up in terms of being eligible for the ballot body to the extent that you're participating in any comment period. And of course, that raises questions about, we don't know how many comment periods there are. So there's a little bit of strategic thinking in terms of how you put that in play. I think the objective, though, of the task force is to make sure we have as many folks that are actively engaged in the process, so you actually come up with a standard. And it's trying to find that sweet spot of making sure that you don't discount someone's engagement because they're interested but not ready to say something just yet. Well, think about that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rich, go ahead.
I wasn't sure I really wanted to make a comment here, but I think one way to engage early in the process, if you're relatively supportive of the concept, positive comments are always welcomed, and what, I think that gets you in right up front. So often in the current process, you only think of comments in terms of why did I vote no? Even though we always ask for positive comments, we get very few. But I think right up front, in general, hey, yes, I support this development, although I'm not ready to say I support the implementation, where we're going, but it's the right way to get started. And I think that would be kind of what we're looking for the initial opening. If you're not opposed, but you want to be involved, hey, I support what you're doing, more later, kind of a comment.
Right, thank you, Rich. So I do want to move us along to the next theme to make sure that we get through all of these. But really great conversation. And again, if we have time at the end, we can circle back. I think we've got a couple of comments that have come in through the chat that maybe we'll get to through one of the other topics, or we can pick up at the end, hopefully. So I think with that, let's switch over to the risk subcommittee. So again, I mean, we got a lot of stakeholder feedback on the risk subcommittee, particularly around the composition of the subcommittee and how members would be put on that committee, and a little bit about what their authority and role is. So I will ask Scott Tomaszewski to provide a little bit of context from the task force before opening it up for discussion.
Thanks, Kristen. And it was nice to see Matt get a lot of support from the rest of us so that we're not on the hot seat for all the discussion just by leading off the discussion. With respect to this particular issue, what the task force was really trying to do was make that connection between the strategic policy direction of the Euro and the development of standards. And that's been sort of a missing component of what's in today's environment. And so the idea behind the risk subcommittee providing that high-level strategic oversight for the standard development process actually aligns with the risk charter and its stated purpose. I mean, you can kind of look at providing front-end high-level leadership accountability for the issues of importance of both power system reliability and assisting the board, and also the entities and stakeholders in coming up with a common understanding. So when you start looking at, if you even look at things like the 901 process and where we've gotten to today, you could look at some of the strategic thinking that could have benefited from that on the front end. We've sort of figured it out. as we get to milestone 4. In milestone 2, we were kind of going on the fly. And so the concept behind having that connection between the strategic direction of what's going on and how that fits into standard development, the risk subcommittee, the way we've envisioned it, provides that link to be able to do that. And so then you get into the issue of how you actually staff that out. And so there have been discussions related to the risk committee itself, what its role is in terms of providing this very high level strategic oversight. Then you've got this subcommittee construct, which basically takes the benefit, it benefits from the strategic discussion at the highest level, and then brings that down one level below that, and then applies that to sort of the development of standards. So it really ties it to the standard development process. And then the question becomes, how do you bring subject matter expertise into that? And that's really the entire equation here. And much of the discussion, at least in terms of what we've seen in terms of comment, has been tied to how you actually staff this out, and concerns about the level of industry expertise that are tied to this subcommittee that's basically going to provide that strategic guidance all along the path. What's also different here, as opposed to what we have in the current environment, is that strategic thinking stays connected to the standards development process from beginning to end. So creation of the term sheet, development of the standards, how it fits into the ultimate decisions that come out of balloting. If there is a concern that balloting doesn't result in a positive outcome, the risk subcommittee has a role in helping guide what the next step is in terms of what the board might do, what happens to the standard moving forward. So that's really all of it. And as you look at the things that we've talked about during various webinars, the risk subcommittee is sort of spread out across everything. So we show up at the beginning with the initiation process. We kind of move the trains forward with drafting the standards, and then we're there helping with sort of providing guidance to the panels that are developing the standards, and ultimately in the balloting process. So there's that connection from beginning to end. What's also nice about that from the standpoint of how it fits into the risk framework and the ERO itself and its priorities is, since the risk committee puts together the risk report that the board approves, they have a unique perspective on understanding how these dots are all connected. And that becomes really important. So that is the missing link, at least in terms of the way we've looked at it. The structure of how we've set this sort of centers around the risk committee providing those linkages throughout the entire process at a high level. And then the challenge is making sure that the subject matter expertise finds its way into the work that makes sure that we don't undermine industry expertise. So that's my dissertation on that. I'm going to turn back to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Scott. So again, at this point, I want to open it up to anyone in the room or on the phone, provide some comments around the risk subcommittee, and for any recommendations you have. I mean, any concerns that you have, what are some recommendations you would have for the task force to consider? Karen, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you. Karen Honoran here on behalf of ELCON. So, full disclosure, we're kind of new to this process, being users, but we do know what is in front of us, that we probably will be much more involved in the standard process. And so the idea of getting involved in the risk committee, or whatever you call it, risk, and RSTC, we need to figure out how to get those staffed on behalf of some of these large customers. Customers have typically in the past just looked to their trade association because they are not subject to registration or standards. We can comment on certain standards if we find that there's some overreach or something, but in general, the users have not been as engaged. And so I want to make sure that when we start to put these committees together, there's a lot of legacy members of these committees that have just been sitting on them for a long, long time. And I want to make sure we're getting the right people that probably haven't been engaged in these committees before and get them engaged. And so I'm really here for the learning process. I probably won't have a whole lot of feedback, but just, keep that in mind that we do have a brand new ecosystem with NERC. I mean, you saw that with the IBRs, and we're going to be seeing that with the large load. And so we need to make sure we understand how to get those committees staffed and the right level people in those committees. So anything that, we can do to get educated on that and get that contact. And I know that Camilo's been doing a fantastic job engaging with our groups, especially the customer level groups. But that's just one thing that, I worry a little bit about, because I know these committees, people have been sitting on them for a while, and it's just an automatic renom, and we're not as aware of the whole process and how to get engaged. So find out a way to make sure we're getting those staffed properly.
Thank you, Karen. Any thoughts, comments, or questions on that one before we go to John? All right, John, Ray, go ahead.
It's going to be a long day if nobody else is talking all the time. So anyway, to kind of spin off a little bit on the topic. One of the things that I think is vital is the stakeholder engagement elements, and clearly risk is going to have a vital part of what we're doing in setting the strategic directions and all those kinds of things. The concern from our community is that risk is not a stakeholder elected, sector represented entity. And so while I think that risk should have an important input into the process, we actually liked a previous scenario where we were talking about a stakeholder council that had sector representation that was elected by your sectors, and then maybe having another group, whether it's the stakeholder coordinating council or group, stakeholder standing committee coordinating group, sorry, got that wrong, or any of the others, to bring all those pieces together to make sure that that standing committee has not only the risk piece, but also the other elements. And to Karen's point, the bringing along these brand new entrants, I think will be vital, and having them at the table and kind of having a space reserved for them at the table from a sector election perspective, I think will be a vital element to getting their engagement from the beginning. And frankly, we've done a lot of stuff on this side of the meter, and we're pretty good at those kinds of things. But understanding what's happening on the other side, we really need that engagement to as we're figuring that piece of it out. So our perspective would be that we would take a look at that broader stakeholder council and have those members of that council elected by their sectors.
Any comments or thoughts or questions from the task force for additional? Tino, please go ahead.
Yeah, just in support of that, the idea that in addition to, given the full span of the process, and as Scott had mentioned, kind of where the subcommittee, the role they play overall throughout these different phases, to have that elected aspect of it from the segment, but also ensure that we also have that diversity across regions, public, private, those things are kind of built in to ensure that representation.
Thank you, Tino. Sue, go ahead.
To maintain strategic oversight through the whole thing and to kind of have this higher level view of the process. And I understand you all like the idea of the stakeholder council elected by sector, but could you talk a little bit about how you might be able to, if if that were to be an option, how would you ensure that the strategic kind of lens is on those activities as opposed to the more compliance / actual language? Does that question make sense?
It does. And so I would say one of the options we talked about was that I'm going to read it to make sure I've got it right. Standing Committee Coordinating Group, that it has members from RISC and RSTC and CCC and from NERC as a group that can bring all of those different viewpoints in terms of an oversight kind of a perspective, with this stakeholder group having a direct connection to that group or something like it. The biggest element for us is making sure that we have sector representation so that we can be sure everyone has a voice and that those individuals are elected by their peer companies to represent them during that stakeholder council type process. We absolutely agree that having, whether it's a dotted line or a direct line, however that would play out, we absolutely agree that getting that strategic focus from RISC is really important. Part of the issue with some of the folks on the RISC side is they have great strategic perspective, but that's about the 30,000 foot is about all they have in terms of getting into the details. We probably need another group, more like the MRC or something like that, that has both the strategic and the tactical level to be able to be engaged in the process as well. Did that answer your question?
I think so. But in thinking it through, I do know that the RISC has, for example, I believe Todd Bennett, as chair of the standards committee, is on it. There are a number of representatives on the RISC now who I do think bring the 20,000 foot level, not the 30,000 foot level. You know, I don't want to get into too many gradations, but so I think the RISC right now does have some, it's a Noah's Ark. There's all different types of people on it.
Committee's leadership selects one person to represent the committee, and the MRC has 3.
MRC has 4.
Yeah, so the reason why we were thinking it could be the MRC, that could also be the entity that leads this group, however we wanted to do it. The problem with RISC is it's selected by the NERC board and the NERC staff as to who's going to be on that committee. And it's important that we have the independent opportunity to decide who we want as a sector to be on these committees doing this really important work. And that's the concern with RISC, is that it's at a very high level and it's an appointed, not an elected group of folks.
We do have a few additional tents up in the room here. We'll go to Srinivas first.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to flip the question that Sue asked. I was like, I know if it's in the other state how this would work, but can the task force or somebody share some light on, has there been any discussions with the RISC on how they're going to oversee this subcommittee and how engaged they're going to be, given it's a very high level group? That's one of the concerns I had too in my comments.
Scott, would you mind? Go ahead, Scott.
I can give you a half answer on that. That conversation is starting. I think when we were looking at it earlier this year as a task force, we were saying, how would that fit into the, it sort of started with, how does it fit into the existing structure of the committees? And so we started to look at the charters, and the risk committee at least had a good connection to a lot of this work that was going to be done. So that's the strategic piece that was part of that. Now you get into the other element of, okay, what does that mean in terms of staffing requirements? You know, the initial response from RISC is sort of like, that's a lot of work. But there's a distinction between a subcommittee that's set up under the guidance and direction of the RISC and having the RISC do that work. And so there's a lot of ways that you can address that issue. You could take, and again, just sort of spitballing here, you could take certain elements, a couple people from the risk committee and have them be part of the subcommittee that kind of oversees this. And then you find a way to bring technical expertise into that process and trying to figure out the sweet spot, if you will. And to Sue's point, in terms of when she was talking, like all of the folks in terms of MRC representation, industry representation, those are implementation issues that could be addressed in terms of how we look at the future appointment of some of those committee members. And so as you create this structure, you would also create an opportunity to say, how would you rethink how risk members are selected? So for example, within the committee structure, within the CCC, we select one member and we sort of have our own way of doing that, but there may be opportunities to kind of change the dynamics of how you would select that person given their role potentially in the work that's done over here. So it really becomes an implementation question. To me, it becomes a question of whether you think you can address the issue of stakeholder representation in a way that makes sense. And I think that was sort of the question. If you can solve that problem, I guess my question would be, would that sort of resolve the general concerns you would have about the structure of the risk subcommittee in sort of the way it works? A little longer answer than I guess
I can respond just real quickly to that. I think that one of the values of the way we've been doing this from the beginning is we are taking a holistic look at everything from soup to nuts, figuring out exactly what is the best way to do it. And as we were thinking about it, we really like the concept of sector elected representatives for this committee. We think that that is the best way to ensure alignment from the very beginning all the way through to the very end. And while we understand that the risk has a charter that makes sense and certainly has a place in this entire conversation, this is a key element for us in being able to make sure that we have elected sector representation on whatever we call this committee and wherever it sits. We think that that's the key element that's missing.
I think that's helpful. That's helpful for us to be able to take back and kind of think about. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you. Any other comments? So the task force will take that back and consider. Any other comments? Again, if you're virtual, feel free to raise your hand or enter any questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A panel around the risk subcommittee. I'm not seeing any other. Oh, I apologize. Yeah, Todd Bennett, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. And maybe one item, just I want to make sure that the task force and all the participants today are aware of, because there's been some comments on this group is the risk is appointed by the board and NERC. And I won't disagree with that. I just wanted to make everybody aware of that within the current charter, it does state that there's a nominating subcommittee. And I would have added this in the chat, but I couldn't figure out how to do so. And it states that there's a nominating subcommittee. It'll consist of 7 members, and it provides some detail on who that is. And it says the risk nominating subcommittee members are nominated by the risk chair and voted on by the full risk membership. So there is some voting and evaluation that goes on at the nomination committee level. So just be aware that's a mechanism that's currently out there. I'm not stating this is the way that this would possibly operate moving forward, but it currently seems like there's a method of alignment. So anyway, just awareness that does currently exist.
Thank you, Todd. So I'm not seeing any other tents or hands or questions in the chat. So I think with that, we will move forward to the stakeholder SME panel. and the recommendations around the SME panel. There were some questions that have come in from stakeholders, again, around how panel members would be selected, maybe how many people the task force is thinking on that panel, and some concern about whether having that structure may cause some burnout from subject matter experts if they are on multiple project teams at a single time. So for this one, I will turn to Joe Fina to provide some context from the task force.
Great, thanks. So moving from the risk subcommittee, the task force thought, okay, well, this subcommittee is going to be looking at the big picture, from a strategic standpoint. Are we going to have drafting teams? How is that going to work? So we landed on this idea of having a project team for each of the standards. And those project teams would be composed of experts. And we thought it would be a good idea to establish a pool of folks that can already be called upon, because we have been hearing concerns that it's been difficult to put together the drafting team, and that's been taking a while, and that there are some folks that are serving on drafting teams over and over again. So the thought was, hopefully this will clarify some of the questions, was that folks can sign up to be part of this pool with a pretty low commitment. By signing up doesn't necessarily mean that you're automatically agreeing to serve on a project team whenever it is that project team is established. Our hope is that that's a yes. But if a year from now or 2 years from now, depending on what the terms of the pool members are, someone is asked to serve in that project team, that person will have another opportunity to decide whether they have the bandwidth to do that or not. Greg Ford, our chair, has said that this pool of folks can be up to 100 people. So from that standpoint, the task force hasn't had a particular number in mind. The goal was really to have folks that are ready on a list, and to shorten the time that it takes to reach out to folks and ask them if they can serve on the project team. So I will stop there. I think that's probably enough to cause a little bit of a stir, and happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Joe. And again, for those virtually, feel free to submit any questions or comments through the Q&A or raise your hand. Anybody in the room want to get us started with conversation around the stakeholder SME panel? Let's go to John again. Go ahead, John.
I feel like I'm talking way too much, but first off, we think this is a great idea. We think that having a large pool vetted somehow, we take a look at, what is coming on the next 2 to 3 years, kind of a horizon, understanding what skill sets are going to be needed for that. Having, this pool with maybe some staggered 2 or 3 year terms somehow, trying to figure out good ways to have great people engaged and involved and ready to go, with enough backups in case there's something that pulls them away from the ability to serve at any point. We also believe that this leans into one of the great elements that we have as an industry, is the expertise we have at that SME level, the people that we have that have been doing this for a long time and understand how it works in the real world, how the physics work versus how the words work on the paper. And so we really think that this is a great idea. We do believe it's going to need to be a large number of people, 75 plus, and with a varied skill set that is somehow vetted and kind of ready to go as needed, but really thinking about it in a strategic sense. So we know that things can come from FERC at any moment, but if we've got an idea based on what our strategic directives are and kind of the elements we have, we ought to have a pretty good idea where we're going to need to focus our efforts. So we might be able to kind of, at least early on, really focus on the types of folks that would be best suited for that type of work. So again, we really like this SME panel. We think it's obviously the details, getting it right, just like everything else, are vital. But we're behind doing this all the way.
Thank you, John. We do have a question that came in from the WebEx. The question is whether the stakeholder SME panel would be the primary drafting team of the standard, or would they be used in a different capacity with NERC and potential use of AI, taking more of the pen and using the panel members as needed? Does the task force have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so many of you have seen in the recommendations that we referenced the version 0. What is that? The idea is that NERC staff would take a first stab at putting something together. And we purposely called it version 0 because that's not the version that's going to be then kicked up to the risk committee to take a look at. Let me take a step back. I mean, I guess in the perfect world, maybe it would be. Your NERC staff is going to do a good job. I know that. But the idea is that the project team would then take a look at that version 0 and create what this is just Joe's thought here. Create version 1 of that draft. And that's the draft then that will end up going up to the risk subcommittee for the subcommittee to take a look at, and then the subcommittee will decide if that's good enough to be put out there for public comment.
Mr. Trevos, go ahead.
Yep. Thanks, Joe, for that explanation. Where does the RSTC review fit in that process?
Yeah, so in the recommendations, we do say that the project team will be able to consult with the RSCC and other experts. So I think our intent is at least to have some flexibility for that project team to get all of the information that it needs. Exactly how that would work would need to be figured out at some point, but our intent was not for them to just go into a room and be forced to come up with everything on their own.
Thanks, Joe. Ruchi.
Yeah, a little bit more understanding about how the SME panel determination will be made, the expertise for it. I think there are a lot of responsibilities we are putting on that SME panel. So what will the time commitment for the SME panel? Would it have to be just entity representatives, or could there be SMEs from OEMs and others that would have opportunity to join as well?
Yes, that's a great question. Our intent is to have a very diversified pool of folks that we can call on. To the extent a project were to come up and we recognize that there isn't somebody necessarily in the pool that can assist, then the subcommittee can go out and have special open calls for folks to volunteer then at that point. The task force is estimating that from the start to the beginning, the process should take about 12 to 18 months. So if a panel member is called to participate on a project team, that's probably going to be the amount of time that they'll need to commit for that particular period of time. Our hope, however, is that the issues that the project team are going to be looking at, and specifically, the panel members, are going to be more narrow than what the drafting team is currently looking at. Why is that? Because before we get to this stage where the panel is going to be heavily involved, hopefully we have a lot of involvement, from stakeholders. We have a term sheet, that's been developed. And so when we get to the drafting stage, that standard will need to be consistent with what the term sheet is. So hopefully as this process moves along, we're narrowing what the issues are and what the focus should be. At least from a task force standpoint, we thought we can also address the, concern I think that we have even now of, burnout and being, overly extensive. So during that 12 to 18 months, yes, you'll be on the list of folks that will be called upon, but exactly how much time you'll be spending, exactly, it'll depend, by the project, but our hope is that it'll be a little bit less than the time that the drafting team members are currently spending on.
Any follow-up?
Yeah, a couple of them, sorry, Srinivas. I am still trying to understand where are we gaining efficiencies with this process? That's one question. Second question, with the SME commitment that we are looking at, 12 to 18 months seems like a long time for someone to continue to have the same priority, committed to that priority, and not have changes in their own roles, responsibilities. If this is organization sponsored, changes in organizations, commitment or priorities, how are we going to address that if in case one of these comes up in the current situation? That's a possibility too.
Yeah, so on that later question, which is an important one, the task force hasn't gotten down to those details. I think that's probably something that would need to be expanded upon in the next phase. On your first question, in terms of the efficiency, our hope is that with leveraging NERC staff, perhaps leveraging AI, setting up this this process of establishing the term sheet that that hopefully that will condense the amount of time that's needed for folks to serve on a particular project team. But it will depend on the particular project and the complexity of it, of course. So it's hard to say, but our goal is for everything to be done within 12 to 18 months.
And we've got a few task force members that have put their tents up, so I'm going to turn to them on this topic. Sue, go ahead.
Yeah, Todd Bennett, I'm going to ask you to speak in a minute, but after 3 years of observing the Standards Committee and seeing the struggles that occur in trying to recruit a drafting team, and then approve a drafting team, and then when they start their work and new projects get added, and I mean, you have drafting teams that have been at it for multiple years who just drop off because they're exhausted and they can't deal with it anymore. And then you have to recruit new members for the drafting team, and you got to start all over again. To me, one of the appeals of having this pre-selected pool of experts is that instead of having to go back and do that, you can just go back to the pool, and hopefully the projects will be shorter and discreter. So this actually will be less, my hope, less of a strain than the current system. Todd, do you have anything to add to that?
Todd Bennett, go ahead. You may be muted.
Or maybe he just left.
All right.
Yeah, Todd
Bennett, we'll
can add
try
some
to
here
come back
too.
to you. Todd Hillman, you want to take?
Todd 3. You go Bennett, Lucas, Hillman in that order. Lucas, Bennett, Hillman. I don't know. It sounds like a law firm. Listen, it's months. And what Sue's talking about is months, and it's Groundhog Day, right? And every CEO I talk to tells them that this is the big problem because they're not going to give you their A and B players unless they have some guarantee that the work will be consistent. So our goal here was to say, listen, if you're on one of these things, we're going to define it better. We're going to make it more consistent so you have a better sense of how long they're going to be on, what they're going to be working on specifically, and why it's important to the companies. So I think laying it out that simple, and we've talked about this as a pool, but also think of it as a bench, right? A bench of players to choose from versus literally going back and starting over, which in sometimes, Sue, has taken 6 to 9 months just to do the reset. If you're going to get this process, Joe, to 12 months, it's a non-starter, right? If you don't answer that question, then, you know, it's a key in the cog to get out of this. Otherwise, yeah, you can make two ends of the process a lot better. But if you have this thing in the middle, you're not going to really move the needle.
That's the efficiency that we need to really focus on.
Yeah, and keep in mind metrics around this everywhere, right? We've heard a lot from you all about metrics. There's going to have to be metrics around this that say it was X months before and it's now X weeks, X days, et cetera, and go back. And that's the other reason the CEOs will go, okay, I'll give support to this because I'm actually seeing process improvement that I can get behind.
Thank you, Todd. And Scott, did you have something to? Scott, did you have something to add before we go to? Okay, go ahead.
And I think to this whole process, there's two things that are critical to make this work. And it's a really solid term sheet on the front end, which allows you to create a version 0 that's better than a blank sheet and also actually relevant to what you're doing. But then also the consensus building component of this for purposes of public input in the process, because you're building that from iteration to iteration. And that was sort of missing. That's missing from the current environment. And so to the extent that you get efficiencies from that, the 12 to 18 months becomes sort of your outlier in terms of where you go. You're really testing the fact that you can do this significantly faster. And when you get to the end, you're not talking about 3 ballots, you're talking about 1. You've already built consensus. You've got that technical expertise being fed into the process from beginning to end. But it doesn't work if you don't have a term sheet that's solid enough to sort of drive the entire process. That becomes really critical towards all of us.
Thank you, Scott. Srinivas, go ahead.
Oh, thanks for all the good discussion. I'm looking forward to the metrics, Todd, clearly. But the one comment I had in terms of how the SME panels is selected is, hopefully you guys already have this in your plan, is to reach out to some of those underrepresented folks that we need, especially with IBRs or with the large loads coming on. I mean, there's a lot of IBR-based load, so we're going to need a lot of those experts to be on those panels. So I don't know if it's reach out to trade associations or direct reach out to the OEMs, because I would certainly like those folks to be engaged, or at least to be part of those pools where we can draw upon that expertise and not scramble at the last minute when the standard is drafted and realize, oh, we need more experts to weigh in this area.
Thank you, Srinivas. And then a couple of questions coming in from the WebEx or comments. So first one, along the same lines around appointments to the Stakeholder SME panel. Joe, if you could talk a little bit about how the task force has been talking about how those appointments themselves would be made to the panel.
Sure. So the risk subcommittee will have an open nominations process. And I think the subcommittee will be keeping an eye on, okay, well, what's, coming, what are some areas that we're probably going to need some help in? And so they'll be looking at, the background of the folks that, submit their names to see if it fits. But I don't, in terms of the task force, we haven't talked about, what criteria would allow the risk, subcommittee to not allow someone to be part of the pool. I think there's kind of a presumption that everybody that submits their name, can probably, contribute. So if we have, 100 folks that are experts in SIP and we don't have anybody on the operation side, we're probably not going to have 100, SIP folks on that bench. So there will be some sort of balancing there, but I think that the intent of the task force is to have the largest pool possible. That's the most, diversified. That's as far as we've gotten so far.
Thank you, Joe. I apologize. Stephanie, thank you. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question, kind of follow up to that. And again, very supportive of this. I think this is a great idea and will gain some efficiencies. My question is around if there's been discussion around how to make setting this up successful, right? So if we're struggling so much right now with even getting folks to sign up for one standard drafting team, how are we going to get folks to put their name on a list to be called upon at any time? So I know that's more in the implementation phase of things, but just wondering if there's been discussion around how will the outreach happen if you don't get a lot of response from industry and from subject matter experts to join this pool, because if we can't get the pool created, then it's not going to, benefit in any way. So just curious if there's been talks about that.
Yeah, so we haven't talked about that yet, but you're absolutely right. I think we're going to have to be engaged. Maybe have a campaign for the panel, kickoff. But our expectation is that we are going to have folks that are going to be interested. I don't think we're going to have 0 folks that are going to want to sign up for this. But we are going to have put in some work to make sure that we have a diverse group for sure.
So go ahead.
And I guess I would say that I think it's important for industry to understand that the price of having a standards process where industry writes the standards is that industry has to step up to write the standards. In the last round, you may remember that we raised the idea of using consultants. And you would have thought that, I won't give you any metaphors, but that was not well received. Let's just put it that way. And to me, the corollary of that is if you don't want third-party expertise, the industry needs to step up to do it. And I'd like to think that that being the honor of being selected for this panel, it would be such a resume builder that people will just be dying to get in the door to be on the panel. So my sincere hope is that industry will step up and do the right thing and provide us with a broad-based and deep pool of expertise. We may have to at some point, for example, there might be somebody at EPRI or there might be somebody at, IEEE who has specific expertise that we may want to pull in on a case-by-case basis. But if we're not going to do consultants, we're going to have to make our own clothes.
Thank you, Sue. Matt, go ahead.
I was going to say I'm 95% sure it's in there, so correct me if I get this wrong, but I think we left the door open, didn't we, too, of if there's a niche item that we can still hire a consultant to bring in, but it's not going to be the standard approach. It's just, when needed. Thanks. All right. I see nodding heads, so I feel good about my memory.
All right. Thank you, Matt. There are a couple of comments coming in from the WebEx. First one, and a couple of these are just comments, not necessarily questions, but a suggestion around whether you really need to have terms for those that are on the panel. I think there's a concern that if someone's term expires while they're in the middle of a drafting project on a project team, how do you manage that? Has the task force talked about that to ensure that people are consistent from the start to finish of a drafting project? I don't know if that's something specifically the task force has necessarily talked to at this point, but it will certainly take that back and consider it as they develop the final recommendations. Another question or comment rather, as we were talking about the participation or the makeup of the SME panel, we did get some comments in through the comment period and here as well around whether or suggesting that the task force consider having nomination periods or open nomination for project teams as well beyond those that are just on the stakeholder panel. Some concern from specifically the public power, smaller entities that may not be able to have the commitment to be on the panel, but still may want to participate on the project team. So again, I don't want to speak for the task force. I don't think the task force has specifically talked about that, but certainly good feedback that they will consider. I'm seeing some nodding heads from Joe and other task force members here in the room. And Ruchi, I see you've got your tent up. Go ahead.
Just a suggestion or recommendation, Sue, to your point about what a great resume building. Yes, absolutely. But we need the right expertise, right? That has to come from, depending upon the project, it is going to be wherever in a given organization. So this appeal is not just to one set of group, it's to entire ERO world as a whole. And I think there is a little bit more outreach and at a different level required to get this right kind of skill set and the commitment from the organizations that may help get the right talent. If we are looking, no consultants, more of industry experts. And I would still suggest that depending upon a project, getting OEM expertise might still be helpful. And this is strictly speaking from an IBR perspective, since a lot of projects currently are in that direction. What can and cannot be done, they only understand that better than even the organizations at this time.
Yeah, having sat through that technical conference in August and seeing how the having the OEMs there broadened and deepened our understanding of the issues. I think that's really important. That doesn't have just to be, sectors. There might be other entities that would be really important to have on the panel. So I agree.
Thank you.
I agree to take that back.
Thank you, Sue. Tina, go ahead.
I just want to add a couple things. One is, I think just more broadly, I think we all know the importance of a very transparent process and the work that's done by the panel, the importance of that and a good record, especially, as there are transitions that, if there are member changes to any particular project, that it doesn't slow things down, that anybody who has to jump in kind of at a midpoint can jump in feeling like it doesn't take a long time for them to get up to speed. So that transparency and that record, I think, are really important. Also, consideration for the role that the regional entities and the expertise they would bring from an audit perspective, interpretation perspective. I know sometimes some of the delays or things can get caught up on language, so those that can help move past that and help work together to address those concerns that may come up to find that resolution.
Yeah, I've been trying to bite my tongue and it hurts now, so I'm just going to say it. If we don't start talking about fear of missing out as a problem here, like I get every sector involved and I do everything and everybody's input's involved, we'll be back at 3 years, okay? It's just a fact. We've got to have people leaning into what Sue said, which is you're going to have to dedicate some time. You're going to have to dedicate some people. And if you're not going to do that, we have to figure out other ways to do it creatively. Because right now, we're trying to get everybody involved and they're not. And so what ends up happening is we get delays and more delays and more delays, and we have a very long process. So fear of missing out can't be an excuse to bring every single party to the table, because it's not happening right now. So what do you ensure that you're going to get that going forward? Make it simpler, make it easier, but it's still going to require people leaning in and making commitments, right? So at the end of the day, this is all designed to say, yes, if you're on board and you make those commitments, NERC and everybody else will be supportive to do that. But you can't have the goal of having everybody involved, because it hasn't worked to this point, and I'm not sure you convince us that it will be the case going forward.
Thank you. Good discussion, everybody. We got another question here from the virtual audience around. So with the recommendations, part of the recommendations are to retire the standards committee, and there is a subcommittee under that, the project management and oversight committee subcommittee. The question is whether the stakeholder SME panel would take over the current PMOS responsibilities. And I think we've got Sujin Kim from NERC on the phone that can take that one on.
Thank you, Kristen. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So what PMOS does in general is it does not necessarily drive all the timelines, but it does report on a lot of the project schedules and make sure that a lot of our postings and our 3-month outlook, all of those things are coordinated. We may not necessarily have the same committee, but some of those functions will be taken over. And once we would get the details for where this, whether it's a risk subcommittee or what other form, we will still be able to basically report out on the projects, their posting schedules, coordinate the postings, ensure that certain projects take priority with regards to posting, and NERC staff can still definitely facilitate that conversation. And we'll try to ensure that all of our postings, if especially if we have this new fast track process, it's very clear as to which projects are coming first and when those postings will take place. It will also help because we're not going to have nearly as many postings. As you may recall from the proposals, it's going to take very few postings. It's going to be basically one ballot, and if necessary, maybe a second one. Right now, we have usually 3 to 4 ballots per project, and that's why there's so much confusion, so much coordination that's necessary. I think that function of posting projects and making sure that everyone is in line with regards to which postings are coming up in the next week or two, we'll be able to facilitate that.
Thank you, Sujan. So it looks like we've got one more comment in the chat here, specifically around, there was some talk before about metrics and developing metrics. And the question is whether if once we develop metrics and if you find after, some period of time that we're not seeing a benefit or there are new problems, would there be an option to either revert back to the existing process or potentially start over, kind of do a reevaluation of the process? Which,
I guess we'll
Joe, you want to take that one?
I guess we'll stand this task force again.
I think the short answer is, of course, but Joe, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so obviously, the NERC board, and Sue can probably speak to this, is very interested in this and has, passed a resolution to establish this task force. They recognize that there's a problem here that has to be fixed. If that problem continues, I think the NERC board will want to continue to figure out a way on how to fix that. So I think if this were to be approved and it is implemented, I'll just speak for myself. I would be an advocate for a continual improvement program, and I think a lot of folks will probably agree with that.
And you want to add, Sue?
I'm not allowed to speak for the board, per Sonia, and our guidelines. But I can say that I know I, as an individual board member, will be very interested to see how whatever we implement works out. And if it's not moving the ball forward significantly, then I will be very interested in trying to figure out why that is and to continue to course correct.
Thank you all. So one more question that has come in and may turn to either Joe or Scott, sort of bridges between the risk subcommittee and the stakeholder SME panel. The question is around who would be the primary group responsible for retiring standards projects. Would that be the SME panel? Would that be would that be solely the responsibility of the risk or the risk subcommittee?
Joe's going to correct me when I say this. So, no, I mean, ultimately it's the risk subcommittee that has that responsibility, but they have to rely on the expertise of the SME panel to do that. So there's a connection between the two that really you can't delink. But ultimately the strategic direction is really what will result in something being canceled or not. I don't know, Joe, you want to?
Yeah, Scott, I agree with that. And there may be some other folks here that serve in our SIR subgroup, but I think it would still need to be a request that comes in, proposal, and would go, have to go through the process, right? You're just like any other standard.
All right, thank you. All right, so last question in the chat here, and then if nothing else pops up, we will move on to the balloting process. There is a question around, so currently the standard drafting team members provide presentations whenever a draft standard is posted for comment or ballot. Has there been any thought to who would take on that role in the new process?
Yeah, we haven't talked about that, but at a high level, I would expect that there would be a chair of the project team, and there would be a chair of the subcommittee, and that once a draft standard is presented to the subcommittee, that there would be some sort of presentation involved in that, and then the subcommittee would I mean, it would be in their interest to be able to have the project team out there and explain what the standard is and how it works in order to get the valuable feedback that we're looking for. So I think it's kind of implied, and we've been assuming this, but yeah, that's a good comment. We can take it back for further thought.
All right, thank you, Joe. All right, not seeing any other. Nope, I apologize. One additional one, and then we'll move to balloting. So in drafting standards, there's more work than just simply writing a standard. There's the technical rationale, the implementation plan, and other supporting documents. Is that something that the task force has thought about at this point around who would be drafting those documents and how that would be managed as well? So all those supplemental documents that accompany a standard.
Yes, this is Joe. I don't think that we have gone into all those details, but I think the thought is that we'll be leveraging NERC staff to help with that. If we're thinking about RSAWs and things like that. But yes, but once the standard is out there for public comment, our intent is that would be the full package. And so how that gets put together, I think there's some flexibility with that, and maybe a question that can be answered in the next phase.
Thank you, Joe. And I know, in the recommendations, there was some discussion around figuring out what pieces, making sure we know which pieces are going to which places. And Sujin, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
I just want to add that we're still going to have to develop the record for each standard before we present it to the board for adoption and file it with FERC. And so all of those supplemental documents, especially the technical rationale documents, the VRFs, VSLs, the RSALs, those will be created, and NERC staff can definitely facilitate ensuring that all of those documents are properly included in all of our filings.
All right, thank you, Sujin. All right, so not seeing any other hands raised. Thank you all for the great discussion on the stakeholder SME panel. Lot of interest and good suggestions for the task force to take back there. So we'll move over now to the balloting process. So really what we're hearing from stakeholders so far is wanting a little bit more clarity on voting eligibility with the requirement around, and we talked a little bit about this earlier today, but with the requirement around submitting comments and that being the catalyst for being eligible to vote. There are situations where trade associations submit comments on behalf of a number of organizations. And so how does that all play into voting eligibility? And then also mentioned earlier with the qualitative data that there are concerns or not really support for the attestation suggestion that was put in the recommendations. And so maybe a little bit more around, well, and maybe one thing to add there has though been general support for some of the other changes, such as like what I mentioned earlier around the ballot pools not being formed early in the process and being closed off from the beginning, some of the changes and flexibility to who can vote on behalf of an entity, and then retaining the ability for an organization to vote within any of the segments that they're eligible for. So with this, I'm going to turn over to Rich to provide some context around, again, just the process. We're not talking about the ballot body structure at this point, but talk about the balloting process changes and then open up for discussion.
Thank you, Kristen. So I want to open with the kind of repeat, I think it was Scott's comment earlier. The whole intent of this balloting process is to confirm a consensus that's already been built through the previous processes, through the standard initiation and drafting. So if we've done our job up front, the ballot should be, I don't want to call it a formality, but there shouldn't be a lot of opposition at that point. The other thing I want to make sure I hope everyone on the call and everyone in the room understands is we heard your comments and we've adapted. So the task force, we are very much focused on ensuring stakeholders still have a strong voice. That was clear in the comments. It was very important, while also creating a balloting process that's timely. We don't want 7 or 8 iterations to get through a ballot, and we've seen some of that today. I am participating in one that's been through, I don't know, I think we have the record now for the longest drafting team, but we're going to get a good product out, so don't worry about it. So I want to talk about 3 things just a little bit. Voting eligibility, the amount of votes, and the attestation question that came up. So entities included as part of a coordinated comment. We saw a lot of those in the comments we got back to this group earlier this morning. So trade association comments in particular, during a standard drafting process, we're not going to require them to submit a separate comment to be eligible to cast a ballot. While the task force has not specifically laid out our proposal yet, we do foresee the submitter of the coordinating comment, typically the trade association, including the names of all the entities on behalf of which it submitted those comments. And NERC could be enlisted to track those entities. So under the current process, the ballot pools are formed early in a standard development process. And once the pool closes, no one else can join. So regardless of how long this takes, you don't get to vote. And I'm going to use the BAL3 standard drafting team as a good example of this. This project goes back to 2017. And if you didn't sign up to vote in the first ballot back in 2018, you're not voting on the next one we put out in a few months. So it's 2024 now. So you can imagine that creates some issues. And there are also several rules in place to the current process around who is eligible to vote, which are fairly restrictive. And that's a frustration to the stakeholders. And if you have a fairly long standard run, just as we talked earlier about members of the standard drafting team perhaps dropping off and having to recruit more. And my experience has been it's not so much frustration with the project as they retire. So you get these subject matter experts on these teams and you know, you don't think that's really an issue, but suddenly it has become an issue to some of them if they run fairly long. So we understand that frustration. With our recommendations, we're essentially envisioning no longer having ballot pools that stakeholders need to join. You would be automatically eligible to vote as long as you've participated in one comment period, as we've discussed earlier. And we think this adds more flexibility and would ease frustrations while also encouraging stakeholders to participate early. The mechanics of that would have to be managed by NERC, and we need to work that out. And we'll include modifications to the current balloting and commenting system. As far as the amount of votes, we are recommending to keep the current rules around an organization being able to have a vote in every segment which it's eligible for. Most entities are eligible in more than one voting segment today, and we wouldn't change that. But we also recommend some changes around who can vote, acknowledging the votes belong to the organization rather than a particular person, and having more flexibility in how an entity manages its votes, such as allowing one person to vote on their behalf in all eligible segments and allowing entities to change their voting representative at their discretion. So again, that gets to the same issue we just discussed. If you have a registered ballot body member and it's a person who's voting on that and they leave, they retire, they leave the company, whatever, it's very difficult to replace that and move it forward. There is also how shall I say this? Occasionally there is not consensus among an organization on how to cast their multiple votes. And a single point of voter might be useful to some people so that they cast consistently. Now, there may be reasons a company wouldn't do that, but that is something we've seen. And finally, attestation. So I'm not going to comment on why we thought this was an issue too much beyond there was some concern that a company's overall strategic view of an issue didn't necessarily match how their voters were voting on a particular issue. So the task force proposed an accountability, as a foundational principle to improving the balloting process. The attestation is not specifically a recommendation yet, but something that we're considering. We have discussed the attestation being a box that is checked when a person casts a ballot, or attesting and certifying their leadership supports the vote being cast. How an organization would manage this is up to them. We are not suggesting that an executive needs to be the person that casts the ballot with attestation. I will say that we did get a lot of comments back on the attestation piece. So, and we'll be continuing to discuss them. I think with that, I want to cover the 5 things that we really wanted to cover in the entire process. And this goes back to when the committee was the task force was first formed up. And I'm just going to go down 5 real quick. There were conflicting votes in the impact on process equity. And we addressed that with the one voter to represent multiple segments. I mentioned the insufficient accountability for ballot positions. That's still an open question. Impediments to participate in the ballot body. We're doing our best to remove those. There is a burdensome and time-consuming process resulting in no votes. We're trying to make that easier. By the time you get to the balloting process, it should be pretty straightforward where you want to go, and hopefully in a yes, because you've had plenty of opportunity to help develop the standard. And finally, the lack of broad industry participation. I think we've heard that discussion consistently this morning in each group. And I think that's very important to make this process work. So with that, Kristen, I think I'll open it up to questions.
All right, thanks, Rich. So again, want to open it up to attendees, provide any comments, provide some clarifications, or maybe your questions, suggestions that may, help to boost support even more for the balloting process changes or alternatives that the task force should consider. Karen?
Yeah, so just one question I might have misheard. On behalf of trade associations that do submit comments, you had said maybe indicating who the members are. Sometimes that's not always possible. Some companies do like to hide behind trade associations. So that's just one area that it may be difficult to fully identify everybody that may be casting a vote with that trade association. And second, as far as the attestation, I understand, that frustration of, having your SME vote, and then, you get a call from the CEO that says, that's not what we want. And understand that frustration, but that is a company specific problem. And I don't think that that's something that NERC should have to work through. I think that is something that is between the SME and the CEO. And so, I would just say for NERC, as far as the attestation, I understand maybe some of the thinking behind it, but don't add more work for yourself. That is a company issue.
So I'll address your first question. If a company or an entity of any kind wants to be part of the registered ballot body, they would have to be in the RBB, and at that point, I would think you'd want your name thrown in just so you're sure your voice is heard. I think that's the intent. You wouldn't really gain much by sitting it out, because then you kind of lose a chance down the line to keep on with your participation. So I think that comes back to the broad industry participation as much as possible, and making sure individuals and companies understand the benefit to the participation in the process.
Any other thoughts around that topic? All right, so there's a question coming in virtually here around the requiring folks to participate in the comment process to be eligible to vote. And so the question is, has the task force thought about, or explain a little bit more about the task force's reasoning and why you feel that having that restriction in place, or having that eligibility requirement in place, adds value to the ballot process, and why didn't the task force, or couldn't the task force consider just allowing people to vote when they're at whatever point when they're able to engage. I know the task force had some conversations.
So we did talk about that, and I think the idea was that we wanted to bring participation in early, so that no one was, if you're participating early and you're part of the registered ballot body, as this process moves forward, you are going to be on the correspondence list, you're going to be seeing everything that comes at you as a particular project moves forward, and it's not going to be a case where, I think, and I don't want to stand on this too hard, but what you really would like to avoid is in a situation where you haven't paid attention to the entire process and you get to very much industry consensus, but a few people, you might look at it from the outside and go, whoa, I can't live with that. And you get no votes when you had no previous comments, and they're basically voting no with comments on stuff on issues that were hopefully addressed earlier, which is usually the case. If you're not aware of it, you're not aware of it. So the intent is, if you're not in early, you're going to miss that. So we want you in early as much as possible, which gets right back to the industry participation goal of the whole thing.
Scott, did you have something to add?
Just one point on that, and Rich is exactly right. The issue is, the whole premise of this entire exercise is not only making sure we have industry engagement in this, but valuing industry engagement. And so providing an opportunity to say, we want your input early, because it's actually going to result in a better product at the end. And so if one way to encourage someone to be an early adopter of being engaged in a discussion is being part of the commenting process, then fine. You should hold us guilty on that one. That's not a bad thing. That's really just trying to provide another way to get people to provide that feedback.
Yeah, thank you. And Scott Klaumanzer, who posed this question, looks like you've raised your hand and may have some additional things to add. Your line's been unmuted. Please go ahead.
My follow-on comment was actually targeted to why I asked the question to begin with, is that it's going to restrict the ability for trade organizations to ask for member support for specific ballots if those members haven't previously commented. So if the trade organization is following the ballot process, following the development process, and has made comments and has done their due diligence and has formed an opinion that they're trying to provide their membership support to, that member will not be able to ballot. So I think that's a fairly significant restriction that doesn't aid the process.
So Scott, I might not have been as clear as I should have been on that, but if a trade organization is submitting comments for multiple organizations, the intent is they would submit the names of those organizations. So that would put those organizations in the registered ballot body and with the full ability to comment independently and vote as the process moves forward.
Yeah, so no intention there to.
No intention to
restrict.
exclude anybody
Yeah.
or give you a proxy voter that you cannot undo.
Does that help, Scott? He may have been muted. Todd Lucas, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'm just reiterating some of the conversation, but I think as we go forward, we've got to think about this process differently than we have in the past, and I really do think it is a significant paradigm shift from where we've been before. I hear the comments about some entities feel like they don't really have the resources to engage in today's process really in a robust way until it comes down to a ballot. And then you uncover in today's process where people have concerns about things that have been previously unexpressed or hadn't been uncovered. I think this really is a shift where that same engagement just needs to move earlier in this process so that it's captured in the development of the standard, not in we think we're ready to ballot and now we find out people don't like what's in there. So I really do think to make this process work, there is a responsibility from the industry to engage early and help mold these. The intent is get a standard we all think is the right answer. That's the real intent. There truly is a pure intent here to get the right engagement early in the process, so we only really spend our effort drafting it and going through that iteration the first time. And so I think it behooves all of us to be thinking about this process differently and kind of remolding where our engagement is important. And we have, and I think Scott Tomaszewski said it quite well. I think in some regards we're kind of unapologetic about trying to drive that engagement earlier, because we think that is one of the efficiencies that you gain in a significant way if we have the early engagement. We identify issues early and are able to address them early. So I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but I think we need to be thinking about this process differently. This isn't just kind of a repackaging of what we do today. It's a paradigm shift from where we are today.
Thank you, Todd. And that spurred a couple of tents up here. So I think Joe, I saw yours go up first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add to what Todd just said. It's really, really important to keep in mind that that this is really different. And just to add one little bit here, there's a reason why the task force and the recommendation uses the words confirmation ballot. That ballot is meant to confirm the understanding that the risk committee has already before we get to the ballot. So it could be yes, we have consensus. It could be a no, but that ballot is really kind of something that comes after we all kind of know where this is going in the first place, but we have to formalize it in order to continue with the process. So you just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Joe. And then we'll go to Scott and then Tino. Scott, go ahead.
Kind of piggybacking off of a lot of the comments and what Todd said also, there's sort of, in looking at a structural change in how you deal with all of this. And if you look at what Rich had described in terms of, if you're listed on something that a trade association does, you're in the ballot body. Well, that also requires the trade associations to look slightly differently in terms of how they manage that issue on behalf of their members, because in many respects, a lot of the trades have that issue with smaller entities that are have concerns about how they're represented. It becomes almost more important for the trade associations to help manage that process for them. And so being on the list to be able to vote, that's one way to do that. Carrying forth the messages that are sort of tied to the development of the standard as we get to various iterations of commenting, that's another way of dealing with it. And then providing guidance to when it's time to ballot and vote. So the trade plays a really important role in that, in terms of dealing with the resource constraint of a lot of the organizations that are very concerned about how they can participate in ERO. Because this is full contact labor intensive. And so what this does is it provides some opportunities, and this is why it's important to continue to get feedback from industry that we can bring back to the task force, is here's our best thinking about how we can address some of those issues that might move the ball forward in terms of some of these concerns we have about representation. And balloting is just another example of how we get representation in balloting. If you think there's a concern about that, it's great to be able to hear that from industry, but our thinking is along the lines of earlier involvement, bringing folks along that may not have the resources to do it, and finding ways for the trades to actually provide that support so that they can make sure that those entities are actually represented as best they can.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Tino?
Yeah, I just want to be clear that the improvement proposed with regard to just having an opportunity to join a ballot at a later phase versus what exists now is a clear improvement that I think, somehow needs to continue to be pushed forward, in my opinion. That said, kind of like the discussion we had before, I think what should be given consideration is the entire suite of improvements being made from the initiation to the drafting to even the opportunity after the confirmation ballot for the project team to go back to the risk and say, here's where we ended up, here's where we think we should go, and question whether or not kind of that administrative, hey, if I can get signed up with a trade organization that will throw my name into the hat and give me the chance to vote down the road or submit just a very simple comment. I like it, I don't like it, just so you can have that opportunity down the road to really lean into all the other improvements and wonder what, in terms of like, and fundamentally at the end, you submit your vote, and if it doesn't quite lean the way of a confirmation, that there are opportunities. And so you've done all the engagement, you've engaged stakeholders, and kind of go with that over maybe just like an administrative aspect so that I can reserve my ability to vote down the line.
Thank you, Tino. So we're coming up at the top of the hour here. We probably have time for maybe one or two more. Michael Bertowski, I see you've got your hand raised on the line. I have unmuted you. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is, while you're discussing the balloting of that and comparing it to our current process, right now, the balloting process that we have is the only mechanism industry has to tell the drafting team we would like to see changes to the wording of a requirement. And the only way we can get changes to that is to vote no. That is the current process. So that doesn't mean we're against the standard or the idea. We're against wording. Now, in this current process you're proposing, there's supposed to be straw polling during the development process, but that will create iterations very similar to what we have. So can you explain to me how the straw polling will work and how the drafting team will respond to industry's comments during straw polling versus currently now the process is when we comment, the drafting team has to reply back and say why we like your comment or not like your comment with reasons and that. But it's unfair that it's negatively portrayed our current process because that is the process that we have. So I see the straw polling as the same thing. We're going to vote no because we need to get some words changed in the straw polling. The drafting team will have a discussion. They'll make changes. It'll come back. So it'll be the same iterative process we currently have. It's just then finally we'll have to say we agree, and then we'll go to a formal one. If my understanding is incorrect, can you help me understand, please?
So I think that comes back to the standard development process and trying to get it right up front. One of the things that would be different, and I almost hesitate to comment on the development process because it's not really my area of expertise, but I'll take a shot at it. That way, when I get it wrong, someone can easily correct it. Right now we do 45-day ballots and such, and then they're extremely long. Plus you got to come back and go through the comments, and every comment must be resolved and so forth. With the straw polls, we were talking about shorter commenting periods, slightly less formal comments, and the ability to address them as needed, but not necessarily address every single one formally. So I think the answer to your question is we're hoping to address that in improvements in the development process. Because right now it's very much like you described. The development is being done in the balloting, and that's a very long and arduous process at times.
Any other additional comments on that? People are getting hungry in here. All right, well, so we will conclude this conversation for now. We will break for a 45-minute lunch here, coming back at 12:45 Mountain Time. And then when we come back, we will have a discussion around the registered ballot body structure, the implementation, and then hopefully some catch up on some questions that maybe we were not able to get to in the morning session, or any other topics that attendees would like to bring up. So thanks again for the conversation this morning. We'll see everyone back at 12:45 Mountain Time. Welcome back, everybody. We are going to get back into the conversation here, and we will pick back up with, actually we'll start with a new topic or a new theme around the registered ballot body structure. All right, thank you. And so for the registered ballot body structure, we had a lot of comments around that. I think I mentioned earlier that it was fairly split across whether folks supported the recommendations versus not. A lot of interest in more details about the overall makeup of the registered ballot body, and some concerns around some of the restructuring and consolidating of some of the segments. And so for this one, I'm going to turn to one of our three Todds, Todd Hillman, to give some task force context before opening it up.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just couple things as we start. Our goal and the charter from NERC and the board was to do things that were transformational, right? So as we came across and we started to do this across all three of the sort of themes here, we had initially come up with some fairly transformational ideas, like make this like a FERC-NOPR process and eliminate all of these sectors and segments in voting. And then we went to a more, okay, well, let's simplify the sector process, get it down to a finite number, and then reduce the votes. And the feedback we got was, well, wow, that was too aggressive. And so the great news here is we had a template to work from, which was the RBB Rec Task Force from last year. They put out a great report in December of last year. And if you haven't read it or you haven't looked at the data within that, I would highly recommend you do that, because in a lot of conversations I've had with folks, their comments could easily have been answered by reading that paper, which is, okay, well, how many segments are here and why is this? And as you made those changes, what did you think about them? And the answer pretty simply is we looked at the data. We worked with NERC staff. We asked a bunch of questions. We kind of laid it out on a board and said, all right, who's getting involved? Who's not getting involved? What are the trends we're seeing? And some of those trends were fairly startling. And so as we look through this, this is sort of just a yes and to the recommendations made in that report, and then working within the constructs of that. The other thing I will say here that it is really important is our goal is by the time we get to the balloting process, we will have already had significant input. We will have had straw polls. We will have had people getting involved and giving us comments very early. So it's not as if you're going to get to the end and get a ton of surprises. That's the goal out of all of this, right? Currently in the current balloting process, you can get to the end and literally have multiple surprises. You could struggle to get quorum. You could then get no votes that are coming out of nowhere that then actually cause people to say, well, I'm going to use the balloting process as an opportunity to redraft. Well, after having gone through all of that work, then to use this as a redrafting process really sets the whole process back. So one of our primary goals throughout all of these phases was to get significant input and know where everybody is ahead of time. So this shouldn't be a surprise when we get to this balloting phase. And so we ended up getting from the current ballot body structure of 10 basically to 6. And how we drove that was looking at the bodies in it. And we understand that there are parties that have multiple, they're in multiple segments. And we heard loud and clear from you all that, listen, I want to retain that. We want to continue to retain that. So that was sort of table stakes for us to say, okay, assuming you want to retain that multiple votes in multiple segments, how do you want to approach this so that you can get the process to be fair, to be efficient, and to be a lot simpler to work through so that you not get to the end and make this very, very complex process. No change to transmission owners. The one change we made on ISO RTOs is we're not going to be adding any of those anytime soon, so you're never going to get to one. Yet at the same time, if you represent, hundreds of millions of people across the footprint, you may want to have the ability to weigh in and vote, which we would never be able to do. So that was a recommendation that we had here. We looked at the parties in 3 and 4 and did a lot of work and said, okay, if people are in multiple segments, how unique are they in the sense that if you have people that are absolutely unique within their current segment, we should have conversations about that. There just aren't that many of them, right? So the fact of the matter is when you pull all this out and look at the facts, there's just not many of those parties that say, listen, I'm a unique sector X or I'm a unique sector Y. And again, the paper walks you through every single registered ballot body entity and how many segments they're in. And that number can be as high as 5 and 6 for one company. So just to level set everybody on where that was. We also looked at voting history, which I think is something that people don't really talk about. That there have been pieces here where you have had people in these certain segments not vote for years. And so I know we all talked about getting more industry involvement and industry participation. You have to show up in order to vote. And so that's another piece of this. We want to drive to say, if we can get some consolidation here and get some folks working together, we might get some better results. And so at the end of the day, that's how we came up with the 6 segments here. As Scott said earlier, really we're trying to confirm what we should already have as consensus. So that this shouldn't be this, this huge exercise at the end of the day. But then we also worked out to make sure we had things in place to say, well, if you don't get the votes that you need out of this, you have a couple of options where we could revise the standard, post another ballot. We could determine that alternative action like section 321 or 322 is needed, or we could actually say, you know what, the standard's not ready for prime time. So even if we don't get to that consensus for some reason, we still have the ability to work it through that based on the votes we get back. So that's where we are today. I know that anytime you do this and you say, I had this vote before and I don't have as much of that vote today or going forward, that doesn't feel great to people. Yet at the same time, again, it's about fairness, it's about representation, and it's also about speed and efficiency.
All right, thank you, Todd. So opening it up for discussion, comments, suggestions, same flow as the day from any attendees here in the room or virtually through raise hand or the Q&A panel. John, you want to get us started?
I'll start. Apparently designated first speaker now. First off, just wanted to say thank you to the committee again for task force again for taking note of the perspectives that came out and really taking those things to heart and changing it so that it's something that is much more in line with what we as stakeholders were comfortable with. I know that was a big step, and I do appreciate that. I think that the entire industry appreciates, taking a look at it, especially building off on work that's already been done with the RBB group and everything. I think that makes a ton of sense, and we really appreciate it. We generally support the changes to the different segments. The one question that I think is somewhat open is how are we going to address these new groups as they come in, and how are we going to make sure that we get their true voice and get their input at the table. I mentioned that previously in other comments, but making sure that as we build these segments and groups up, that we do it in a way that is inclusive and is bringing people into the process. We talked about wanting them in at the very beginning and all that, and making sure that we have a really good way to do that. So again, appreciate that the work that the task force has done in this area, and appreciate very much listening to us and the feedback that the industry provided. Very happy with the direction we've gone. Thank you.
Yeah, Camilo, Sonia, and I have had a lot of conversations about outreach. The other part of this too, by the way, is a lot of, or I don't know, Sonia, if it's a lot, but it's a fair amount of cleanup work, right? That's also involved here in the sense that there's a lot of entities currently that are listed that are either no longer there or, right? So part of this is cleanup work that's got to be done that we haven't done in a while just because we've been trying to make sure we're getting quorum and getting consensus along the way. But to your point, it's going to take a lot of outreach, John, and I think that's where Sonia and I and Camilo I know is very involved and dedicated in saying, listen, okay, we understand, for example, that end users, we think that's a huge potential segment, but right now and in the past, it hasn't been. We don't want to, we don't want to minimize that. We actually want to kind of lean into that. But in the meantime, we have to be just realistic about who's in there now and what that represents. And if we have the good problem, which is a lot more come, that's great. And this isn't, this isn't all put on a tablet where we can never change it, right? It's not the NERC 10 commandments where if you can't drop them or they won't break. We certainly are able to flex and pivot based on sort of where these sectors go in the future. Sorry, segments, Sonia. I'm still on the segment sector problem.
Any other thoughts or discussion on that or any other topic around balloting structure? Srinivas.
I'm the designated second speaker, so after John. But thanks for all the work that has been done here. I totally agree with Todd and John, appreciate it. But I was just curious to understand, has there any discussion been at the task force about the sectors and the segments and whether we can get rid of both and just have one kind of representation across the whole thing? Given this is an opportunity to do so, or maybe I'm thinking, or that's wishful thinking, I don't know.
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I understand the question. Are you saying that instead of using segments for one thing and sectors for another purpose, it's just to do one thing?
Yeah, why don't we align?
Yeah, we got it.
Well, I mean, we did propose that in the first white paper, right? But that was not well received. So we're staying with segments as a result. I mean, it's that was very strong feedback that we received that, sector would not be the way to go. So.
Anything else to add on that? Okay. So we do have a question in the chat, not really necessarily about the segment restructuring, but Todd, you did mention a lot of the balloting process changes are, trying to get consensus early on, and then using the balloting process or using the balloting just for the confirmation. And we've talked about that a bit through some of the other conversations as well. So if the task force is envisioning where engagement and consensus is being built throughout the process early on, and you have that consensus, then is there really a need for a ballot in 321 and these other options out there?
Yeah, we had a lot of, Sonia's smiling and I'm smiling. We had a lot of conversations about this one too, meaning if you do all these jobs right, it should be a check the box exercise. Wouldn't that be great? Where it would take, a half a day. I mean, listening to the stories of NERC about the issues they have to go through just to sort of get these things to a ability to ballot, and then surprises that they get once you get to ballot. If we had no surprises and an efficient process, and then we would take that to FERC, that feels pretty darn good to me. Like we've really actually done our job. To Sue's point earlier, we've done our job, we've leaned in and we've got the work done, and we've brought a really good standard forward that the industry supports. I think that's a great outcome to have here. So, but I think in the end, you still need to have a formal process in the bylaws. I believe it's still required, Sonia. Is that correct? Unless we changed them.
Not really. I mean, we did propose early on
Yeah.
that we would do away with balloting, and we
Yeah.
would create a different structure to, I guess, gauge consensus, right? And document the consensus. That was, again, not popular, surprisingly. But so here we are, right? I was smiling because I do think that that's the intent, right? That the balloting is not the driver, right? It's not the tail wagging the dog. As it is today, but but I think that there is a place for that formal vote to take place, and what we're focusing on now is, Todd explained, is a less complex RBB that still includes everyone who has an interest, and but it's manageable. And the current one is just not manageable, and we have a number of sectors that are underutilized. And, it's just not sustainable.
Scott, did you have something to add?
Just one thing. And I think that the distinction between a formal ballot that basically says, here's our final sign off of it as industry, as opposed to consensus building is still a little bit interpretive. And that's sort of gauging success as you move forward. So we want to make sure we distinguish between the two.
All right. So another question coming in on the WebEx here. So recognizing the RBB task force recommendations were, an important input and driver for these recommendations. There was a recommendation in there around clarifying the definitions of the TDU and the LSC sectors rather than consolidating them. So can you talk a little bit more about why the task force did not necessarily go with the task force or the RBB task force's recommendation on that and went instead to consolidate or recommended to consolidate?
Yeah. So, and Sonia, help me out here if I get off base, but we looked at the thing in aggregate, right? So if you can be in any segment you want or any segment you theoretically qualify for, you're really trying to look for the ones where you have a whole bunch of people that, it's the old Sesame Street game. One of these things is not like the other. And you wanted to find a whole bunch of those to go, okay, there's a reason that these guys need their own sector. And in each and every one of those cases, 9 and 10, 4 and 5, 6 and 7, end users, the bottom two, and then LSE TDU, the overlap just wasn't significant. Or when you looked at it, you would say, okay, well, they're also in other segments, right? So what you end up trying to find is there those unique parties that say, I am just this entity and I need representation. And we really just couldn't find many of those, or we found such a small number that we would want to have conversations and say, where do you think you need to be, right? Where do you want to be represented? Where is that voice to you most important? And that's where that outreach would come in, right? So that's where Camilo and I have conversations and say, we probably need to get 3 or 4 folks on the phone and just ask them that question. And not insignificant of this too, to put a finer point on it is, I think when we clean up these lists, that problem gets even smaller, right? There are entities that we said, well, we asked questions from our sub team, they said, well, actually, we're not even sure that company qualifies anymore, or nope, they're not even registered anymore, right? So the cleanup in itself, I think, would also help to clarify a lot of that. But we did not find any significant parties that said, no, you have to basically be in this own sector, because there were so many in the different sectors that looked a lot like each other. And so if you want that industry discussion and that industry voice and consensus, you want it to be separate, distinct, and providing unique feedback. And so that's where we approached it.
Any other comments or suggestions related to the registered ballot body structure? If not at the moment, I don't see any more on the chat. We did have a handful of questions left over from the balloting process discussion. So I'm going to suggest that before we move on to implementation, let's try to hit on the rest of the balloting questions that we had in the Q&A. And so Todd, Rich, or anyone from the task force, feel free to jump in on some of these. So one of the questions here with all the changes being recommended for the process and the segments and so forth, and this actually, Sujin, this may be a question for you, but is there a plan to change the platform? So the standard balloting system platform that is currently used today, it is helpful for industry to see to see comments submitted by other entities, and would ask that be retained. So just some questions around whether those tools would be managed and suggestions to keep.
Sure, I can take that. So no matter what, we're going to have a good platform. What that looks like as far as having transparency with the comments and the voting, we're not necessarily certain on, but what we will put in place is after the MSPP projects our proposals are accepted by the board and we file those changes, we have a proposal in place with IT to either build a new system, create a new balloting software, or to see if there's any type of online system that we can use. Before MSPP even initiated, there was a discussion with IT to see how we could upgrade our system just generally
to make it more user-friendly, and to make comments more readily available. As many of you know, those comments and comment forms and the raw comments take a manual process just to get them ready and presentable. But we will preserve a system. I don't know what the system's going to look like yet. It will be highly dependent on the proposal that gets presented to the board in February.
Thank you, Sujin. So the next one, we had a couple of questions come in around proxies for voting, for balloting, and whether proxies would still be allowed, or whether proxies would be allowed, or suggesting that allowing for primary and secondary type. I know there was some conversation earlier around the task force's intent, where the vote really belongs to the organization. So there are some recommendations to really relax the who within the organization can vote on that company's behalf. So Rich or Todd, is there anything that you'd like to elaborate on regarding to proxies?
So I think if we were to move the voting by organization rather than by person, which we've talked about, we haven't flushed this process out yet. But I think if you look at the white paper and what we discussed earlier this morning, that would be the intent. You would move this off to the, you'd register as a specific entity more so than as the individual. And we haven't worked that out, but the intent would be that you wouldn't have a difficulty with a proxy. We wouldn't necessarily even call it that, but.
All right. Any other comments? Okay. Let's see if there's any others coming in here. So as we were talking earlier about the commenting and trade organizations commenting on behalf of several organizations, and then, having some opportunity to allow their member companies to still have the ability to vote later. There were a couple of comments that came in, acknowledging that seemed like an administrative burden on the trade organizations, and would there be a different way to do that? Either having an organization actually submit an attestation, or how would you manage that? But some concern about the burden that might place on a trade organization. Any thoughts?
Yeah, no thoughts other than you have some trade associations that are in the RBB, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Yeah, there's a couple that are already in there. I think APPA is, NRECA is, if I remember my lists right. But it's something we probably should go back and chat about, which is sort of the placement and participation of trade associations within this. What I don't want to have happen is you have now 63 trade associations that now all of a sudden come up out of the woodwork and, want to get votes, because now we're back to square one. So.
Could I just ask if the person who asked that question could elaborate a little bit on what kind of undue burdens would be placed on the trade association to presumably list the members on behalf of whom they're filing those comments?
Yeah, so I think that maybe came from a couple of folks. So if anybody who had submitted that question or comment earlier would be willing to raise their hand and provide a little bit more context around their comment, we will look out for your hand.
So while we're waiting, Sue, what I found, at least at FERC, it's fairly common for associations to list, even in footnotes, who is on board with that and not on board with that, right? So I don't think it's a fairly unique practice to ask for it, if I remember.
Well, I do know that there's some trade associations that have like 700 members or
Yeah, I hear you.
1,000 members.
Right.
And so,
Maybe.
that may, but I don't want to make up the question,
Yeah, I hear
that's why I asked.
Are we talking about it from an attestation perspective, or a list of voting consensus buildings, that thing that we were talking about earlier today?
But we're not talking about attestation, right? We're talking about.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
I think we're talking about the question that was discussed earlier, that, if your trade association is participating during the consensus building phase, can you vote? Well, we kind of need to know, that they were engaged on your behalf. And What I would say is, and when we go to implementation, you'll hear that again. There is a level of detail that we can only define once we actually finalize a proposal, right? So I completely understand the desire to really get to the nitty gritty, but we are going to have to deal with some of these logistics later at a later stage. And I think that it's important to understand that, as so many people said today, this is not about excluding anybody from the process. It's about promoting earlier participation because that's much more effective and efficient, and dealing with the usual, okay, I don't like these words, I don't like those words in the drafting stage as opposed to the balloting stage. It's as simple as that. Of course, how we implement it matters, but we are going to get to that phase once we get to a final set of recommendations.
Yeah, and Jenny, and I apologize, Jenny Wyke, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. I think you were one of the ones that had submitted that. I see your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm Jenny Wyke from Tacoma Power, and I'm also on the NERC Standards Committee. And so my question was exactly as was just stated. It was a process implementation concern of participating in the balloting. There are, as noted, some trades organizations with hundreds of entities that they're representing, and it could be a huge burden for the trade rep to have to then solicit all, a couple hundred of the members, document who's supporting and then not supporting, and put that in whatever voting system we end up using. So that was kind of my comment. It was on the process side of it, of how much of a burden that is to do that. And especially if we're talking about shortening the comment period from 45 days to something less than that, it's going to be real hard to track down all the entities who want to support that comment and then get it in the system.
Thank you, Jenny, for clarifying. Any additional thoughts or questions? All right. Well, I think with that, we will move on to the implementation theme. And then if there's some time left, we'll get back to any other outstanding questions or any other topics that attendees want to bring up. So let's move on to the implementation and what happens after these recommendations are brought to the board in February. We did get a lot of questions around wanting to understand a little bit more around the timing and the process for that, including any updates to standard processes manual or other documents, impacts to existing projects, and any metrics along the way as well. So on this one, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia.
Thank you, Kristen. So, we've talked a lot about the timeline leading up to February when the board's going to be asked to consider the proposals, right? Maybe we haven't spent enough time making clear that the proposals are not self-implementing, right? These changes are going to require a number of revisions to the current rules of procedure, including, Section 300, the Standards Process Manual, standing committee charters. There's a whole host of things that need to be revised, and they will be revised again once we have a proposal in place, right? We cannot begin drafting the regulatory language before we know where we're going. So once assuming the board reacts positively to the proposal that's being drafted and will be presented in February, then NERC staff, with the support of the existing task force members, will begin the process of drafting new rules of procedure that reflect the revised processes. As you may or may not know, our process to modify the rules of procedure involve a lot of stakeholder outreach and input. So at a bare minimum, we have to submit the changes for 45 comment period. Depending on the kinds of changes that are made, in response to comments, then, we may have another posting. I would expect that given the volume of changes, we will have, a significant, we might be in a position of having more than one posting. All of that before it goes back to the board for an actual approval, right? Which at that point means filing with FERC for yet another process, right? Where FERC will seek input and then make a decision. So no change will actually, so the vast majority of these changes will require drafting of rules of procedure revisions, posting for comments, consideration of comments, revisions as necessary, posting for board approval, filing with FERC approval, and then, they become implementable. As part of these changes will also require revisions to the standards process manual, which, although that's a part of the rules of procedure, it has a special process for it being changed. It has to be balloted. So that will happen, as much as possible in parallel. We'll try to be as efficient as possible, but for the next, for most of, several months, at least in 2026, you can expect that we're going to be drafting the revisions to the actual words of the rules and be putting them through these processes that exist today that we've done before, right? We haven't done it to this magnitude, but we've done them before. Balloting changes to SPM, posting changes to rules of procedure. We're also going to need to do revisions to standing committee charters. That's, yet a different process. It's a more streamlined process in that most of it will happen within the standing committee, but it also gets posted for board approval. So can't tell you exactly, how many months each step will take, but you should expect that this will take a good chunk of 2026. And then, FERC consideration of these proposals will take, another good chunk of the year. So I would imagine that we're looking at implementation realistically in 2027 as a result. So my bigger point here is, it will, go down several levels of detail through a process that remains incredibly participatory and where, anyone will be able to follow and understand, what we're doing and provide input, to influence these changes. Obviously, we'll have the threshold direction, right, in the proposal, but as we know, the details are very important as well. So that's it in a nutshell, and happy to talk further about that.
Thanks, Sonia. And one comment that came in earlier, a question that came in earlier, I think is related. I mean, you mentioned that obviously there are a lot of details that will need to be worked out, and a lot of that will happen in the implementation stage with opportunities for comment. This question backs up just one step further, asking, as the task force develops its final recommendations, is there an opportunity, is there a formal opportunity planned to vote on the final changes before they go to the board?
I'm not aware of any plans for submitting the recommendations as such to any kind of vote. We've had this very deliberate and broad engagement, but I think that the next vote that I'm looking for is the NERC Board of Trustees to then, allow us to continue to drive this process forward.
Thank you. Any questions for Sonia or the task force, or any suggestion or anything to consider as we're talking implementation? And let's go to John.
So, to that point, I guess one of the questions that I might have is that, if this is the last opportunity we have to provide feedback, we haven't seen the final yet. And so the board won't get any additional, perspectives we might have, until we've seen what is going to be presented to the board. I guess, if we don't know what the final thing exactly looks like, I'm not sure how we can provide additional insights prior to it going to the board. So, and I maybe just be missing the boat here. So just trying to make sure I understand the process.
No, I think that's a very good question. But we, we'll take back all the feedback that we are receiving today and we'll receive at the next meeting next week. I think the task force needs to sit back and think about, okay, how are we going to address these, right? And what's the level of change, right? So, we don't have right now a formal next round of comments planned, but we are keenly aware of the need to allow folks to continue to engage with the process, right? And so at the very minimum, we have the opportunities at the MRC, upcoming MRC meeting and the board itself. But I think that, will be important for us to continue to think about what additional engagement makes sense, depending on the level of changes that we make exactly, for the reasons you're pointing out.
Todd, did you
Yeah,
have
so
something?
John and everybody, the task force is meeting up again, I think in early December, right? To sort of kick that around again. I think after that, we will certainly have a dialogue and discussion on sort of what's left in terms of feedback that we need. And I can't imagine we're going to go dark between December 1st and February NERC board meeting. So I imagine there's going to be something in between there where we're going to, maybe it's almost like a tote board, and I'm just spitballing here, right? Where there's some things that we've got to figure out and we need more feedback on a couple things, but there's stuff that we have gotten great feedback on that we can sort of just, continue to focus on the stuff that still needs some work. So, but we can go back and talk to Greg and Todd and just see what that looks like. But yeah, I think, John, you'll get certainly more opportunities both on a formal and informal basis to keep us going in the right direction.
Great. So Sonia, going back to the implementation, once the board makes its decision in February, I know you talked about this a bit, but can you explain again just a little bit more around how the industry would be involved in developing the details of the changes? Is there an expectation that the task force or some other task force might be involved that would include industry participation in the implementation development?
So, I guess I've enlisted the existing task force. We haven't discussed exactly how that works, but, I think it's more efficient, and that's been the process in prior, in pretty much every change to the rules of procedure that I've been involved with, that NERC staff will, draft it. We're not drafting in a vacuum, obviously, right? We're drafting based on this extensive body of work. And I think that, at least from my perspective, it would be important to retain access to the task force, right? And retain the task force as it exists. But this is absolutely something we haven't discussed and we need to discuss. But that would be my proposal, because I think, we would need that support, right, to continue to. But our regular process involves posting language, receiving comments, addressing comments, right? So the involvement in shaping this language is not limited to task force members. You couldn't possibly write, regulatory language with 700 people in the room, but, people will have the opportunity to comment on it.
Srinivas?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, is there like an official sunset date for this task force? Okay.
We did just get a suggestion through the chat for consideration by the task force to perhaps have an industry webinar in January on the final recommendations before they are considered by the board in February, to allow some time for industry to understand what has been changed. So, take that and some of these other comments back to the task force and consider that as they develop the final recommendations. And then the next question here is, would the task force turn into sort of a check and adjust committee to ensure that continuous improvement in the process happens and metrics are used and distributed, or who would monitor or kind of take that part on? I don't know if that's something that the task force has necessarily discussed at this point. Maybe something for Todd, you want to take that one on?
Yeah, we've certainly started to, and I think this will be some good work we'll take to early December for each of the subgroups to then start to ask questions around what would be the key metrics as we think about that. And, try and not make it 50 of them, right? This is just Todd Hillman's opinion. Make it, 5 to 7, make them impactful, make it the key stuff about efficiency, process, and execution, right? So, and then we're going to need to work with NERC because NERC's going to do all that work. So, right. So let's make sure that NERC is comfortable, tracking that and following that and helping the industry do that.
Good, great comments, great discussion. Any others from anybody in the room or for those on the phone? Jenny, yeah, go ahead.
I just have a question about some of the low priority projects that are out there. Will there be a push to get those complete before the implementation of this new process, or have you thought about how to handle some of those projects?
So Jen, is that one that you?
Yeah, I was gonna take that if that's okay. So right now we have a lot of high priority projects for next year. Once the recommendations get presented to the board and we actually have a path forward, what we would like to do is either take the low priority projects and recommend them either to be off ramped or moved maybe to a different project, or maybe see if there's any other project or SARs that could take those projects. But again, if we move and transition into this new process over the next year, probably 2027 and beyond, it will probably go into the new process where they go to the standards workshops and get prioritized again.
All right, thank you, Sujan. Anything else around implementation? All right, well, seeing nothing there. We do have some questions that we weren't able to get to specifically earlier on with the feedback and engagement. I think we've got 1 or 2 comments from that one. So we'll open this up just sort of as a catch-all. I'll ask a couple of the questions that have come up that we haven't gotten to, but also if there are any other specific pieces of feedback that any attendees want to provide on any topics that we've covered today or any that we have not. Or for task force members, if there's anything more that you want to ask attendees about from their comments and get a little bit more clarity on any feedback that's being provided, now would be the time to do that. So we'll get started with some of the questions that we were not able to get to this morning. So when we were talking about feedback and engagement, with the twice-a-year process that the task force is recommending, and the standard initiation requests being essentially open for comment twice per year, there are some concerns around getting a flood of those requests to comment on. Has there been any discussion around how long those would be commented on, or is there a concern about whether industry will actually really be able to keep up with commenting and providing input on a number of standard initiation requests at one time? And I'll open that up to, Matt, you want to go?
I was actually going to ask a question to Mark or any of the other NERC folks. Have we actually experienced the inrush of like SARs at any point?
Not SARs, but directives. And this would take us back to like 2011 when we were running off to 693.
Yeah.
And that's when we used PMOS to help us decide how many to get out because we were flooding industry. I don't expect to get a flood. I honestly don't think we're gonna get a flood.
And I suspect too, we have that stage gate at the beginning for the RSTC review that, if there were a flood for some reason, that some portion of those aren't going to be ready to go to prioritization, that would have to go back and have some additional work. So I think
You'll see things coming from the RSTC because they got their strategic plan every year. You've been probably part of that, everybody's going to be part of that discussion.
Yeah.
I think what it does offer is this opportunity to really air out what's in the SAR from an industry perspective. If we get a lot of them and if we can, then we'd probably ask for a quick prioritization and work on the highs and then work our way through.
I was going to say, even if there is a flood, I mean,
we can manage it through
ultimately,
prioritization.
Ultimately, this is a resource prioritization process that, going back to Jenny's question earlier about the lower priority items, you start to develop a queue that you work off over time, right? But,
Well, or get rid of.
Yeah.
We can't do everything. If it's a low enough priority, then maybe we don't.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to have a prioritization. You have a certain throughput that has to match up with that. We should just go to the RTOs and ask how they've handled how they handle their queues.
All right, so next question. So if with the intent to summarize comments that come in, would the as submitted comments be shared publicly? And I think this probably gets into some of those details that the task force hasn't specifically gotten into, but I know one of the pieces that the task force has certainly talked about is ensuring transparency throughout the process. So I don't know that this is one that the task force has specifically talked about, but if any task force members wanted to hit on that. Matt?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So with the intent to summarize comments that come in, would the as submitted comments be shared with the public? The thought there is that, there's some issues that have nuances that they want to make sure remain available to the public and for the record. So not losing the raw comments that come in.
My recollection was yes. Okay, I see Joe nod. Yeah.
I wish we didn't get the same ones over and over and over again. But cut and paste. Hard to get through that.
All right, great. All right, we still have some time here. So the proposed recommendations mention the involvement of NERC staff in various points. Would there be various internal NERC teams involved as part of the process? So engineering, compliance, and others as needed. The concern about auditability and compliance implementation. And so it's, getting the technical details correct in the standard and having appropriate language is important. So would there be multiple teams across NERC involved in all of those aspects?
Yes. In fact, I think to an extent that happens today. Compliance folks from NERC staff do call in at the right time for certain standard drafting team meetings. Legal is there supporting throughout the process as well. Engineering will come in when needed. If there's some technical expertise that's supportive. So that happens today to a certain extent. We could formalize it a little bit more, I suppose, but
All right. I think we've got a few more coming in here on the WebEx. So some of the time for revised standards to become effective is taken up by, FERC taken up with FERC waiting for approvals from FERC. So has the task force talked about or talked with FERC rather about how they can potentially reduce the time on their side on as part of the process, or has there been any conversation about any ability there?
Is Cal on the line?
I don't believe so.
But in all seriousness, I will say that FERC has been involved from the jump on this entire process, right? And so I think that's been an important and a great thing that when the task force got together, did. He spends a lot of time in these meetings listening and then providing feedback, sort of in keeping us on the right roads, I think. And so as we head towards the FERC conversation and decision, I feel fairly confident he has been digesting this back at home base and walking them through sort of where we are and what we're working on. So I feel very confident that he's been actively engaged and certainly been to be as helpful as possible as we work through the process. So I feel very confident there.
Also, I think that FERC has been quicker turning around standards than they were initially, back in the day. It would sometimes take 18 months, told us to do something in 3 months and took them 18 months to respond back. That we're not seeing that anymore. So they've also been pretty, turning it around pretty quick. Yeah.
All right. Anything in the room about oh, Scott, go ahead.
Since John's been like our 12th man on the task force today with starting the conversation, I wanted to ask a follow-up question to what you were talking about in terms of comments and expectations, which might provide us with some insight. So to the extent that there's a round of comments related to the next version of that, is there an expectation that the task force would be thought of to respond for that? Or is that more comment for board consideration as they kind of take what we've taken as a first draft, created a second draft? This is basically our final offering. And here's an opportunity for industry to let the board know what they're concerned about or not concerned about for their consideration, because our work is done as a task force for phase one. So just kind of thinking through the mechanics of that, and that would actually inform how we might talk about that in December. What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I have an answer on exactly how it would work. Given that there will be another round and we've asked for some, I wouldn't say significant, but some meaty changes to things that we think are important. And however that plays out inside the task force, there may be something that we would want to, some way we would want to share that information rather than just having to do it in front of the board during the February board meeting. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to find a way to, even if we have a separate meeting, in advance of the board meeting or something, some way to really talk about any, I don't know that they're quite fatal flaws, but significant concerns that we want to make sure get to the board before they make their decisions. So I'm not sure that I have a solution for how to do it, just a concern that we haven't seen the final, so we don't know what we agree with and don't yet.
I mean, I think that's helpful. Just in terms of for our consideration, what additional exchange would there be an expectation of, and then how would that impact what we do or don't do? So that's helpful.
Yeah, Srinivas, go ahead.
Yes, Scott, thanks for asking that question. I think one thing that I may suggest is once you guys have deliberated in December after your meeting and you have landed on whatever the final options are, I think somebody suggested maybe an industry webinar or something saying, hey, this is what we landed up with, and maybe go to the extent of posting some of those slides or whatever like a week in advance or something, so the industry can then react, because that'll give you guys an opportunity during maybe that particular webinar, at least by the way of chat or whatever, to see if industry still has a lot of concern, if that's something you want to understand. So something like a posting for a week in advance of the webinar would tremendously help the industry, I think, in terms of digesting some of that information and then reacting to it. Just a thought.
Thank you. So not seeing other tents in the room, there is another question over here. So going back to the standard initiation request submittal, Right now, the task force is recommending the biannual process of having the submittal window. Would there be an openness, or I guess a suggestion for the task force to consider having the ability to submit standard initiation requests at any time with a notice that it would be then grouped with others in the next window? So something for the task force to consider, just expanding the timing for when standard initiation requests could be submitted.
So you're actually, that would be an open window, basically. You could submit.
Sounds like it, yes.
Yeah, and that actually, you know, that's certainly something we can take back.
All right. Scott, is your tent left up from before? You have nothing to say? All right. Any more comments in the room on any topic? Again, whether we've talked about it today or not. Srinivas.
I can stir the pot up again. And this is an assumption on my part, and you guys can let me know if I'm right or wrong. The work that this task force is doing is not going to impact any of the work that's happening under the large loads initiatives, right? Because I think we're looking at registering some of the large loads, if I'm following the process correctly there. And if once they do get registered, maybe this process will apply to them when standards are being written for them. Is that a fair assumption?
I think that's fair. And of course, they're going to help us write the standards. They're going to follow, right? Yeah. But this is totally separate.
Yeah, hopefully the SME panel that we're looking at, we should look at recruiting those up front. Thank you.
All right, great. I think we had one more question from earlier, going back to the attestations and discussing that. I mean, you know, we know that that was generally not supported by industry, but there was a question just to explain a little bit more about what was the purpose behind the what the task force was suggesting, or at least throwing out as a possibility with the attestations, and what the problem was that they're trying to solve. So I think, Rich, you talked to that one. If you could just revisit what the purpose was that the task force was thinking about as it developed the idea around attestations.
So there was some indication that at times a company's perspective on a given reliability issue wasn't necessarily reflected in their voting on a particular standard. So the attestation idea was, I don't want to call it Sarbanes-Oxley for NERC, but because then we'll never get any help with this thing. But the idea was that there would be some sort of control in place at these organizations to ensure that the voting members were aligned with the strategic direction of the company. I think everybody in their own organization can see where sometimes the strategic outlook of the company doesn't necessarily align with, you know, what they see as a big issue in a shorter term than that. So that's kind of the idea there. But I did sympathize with Karen's comment that most companies need to work this issue out internally. If it's occurring for this issue, it's probably occurring on other things too. So perhaps it's worth a look.
Thanks, Rich. We got some other task force members on the phone too. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything. Feel free to raise your hand. Let's see. All right. We do not have any questions here, although I do see a hand raised. And I'm going to unmute you. It looks like you're on the phone only, so please go ahead. You've raised your hand on the phone.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you state your name, please?
Yeah, sure. This is Joe McClung with JEA, and I'm planning to attend the Atlanta forum, and I was just curious. I've heard a lot of discussion here about some feedback that's been received, especially on attestations and some other topics that it sounds like certain paths are being abandoned by the MSPP based upon feedback. And so I'm just curious if there's a list of the comments that have been received, or if the MSPP task force could share prior to the Atlanta meeting if there's a new direction, and if certain areas are being, abandoned, so we don't focus on those topics in the Atlanta meeting. That would be helpful. And I'd be curious to listen to your response. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. And one thing real quick, and I should have mentioned this earlier, all of the raw comments that came in on the draft recommendations are now posted on the NERC website. So if you go out there, there's a fun spreadsheet with all of the responses that have come in. So those are transparent. And I see Sue Kelly has her tent up. So please go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, if we've left the impression that we have already abandoned certain proposals that we came in the door with, that's an erroneous impression. We are taking your feedback. We are fully and fairly considering that feedback, but don't assume that there's certain things that were on the table coming in the door today that are not going to be on the table in Atlanta. You should, provide your full array of feedback. Don't assume that something has been abandoned.
Joe, go ahead.
And just to add to that.
Go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
Joe McClung, did you have something to follow up on? I apologize. I went to Joe in the room.
I'm sorry. I was just trying to understand clearly. Has any particular directive been changed since the since the last posting? Just want to be clear before I show up to Atlanta with the strategy of discussion. Okay, thanks.
Yep, no problem. All right, now Joe Fina, sorry about that. Go ahead.
It's okay. Well, Joe McClung, if you have been on calls where people just say Joe and either one of us respond, so we're used to this already. I was just going to say, given that all the comments are out there, I would encourage folks to take a look at those, and if there is agreement or a disagreement with some of your peers out there, it would be good for us to hear that at the next forum. So please take a look at that because that will help us, figure things out when we meet in person early next month.
All right, great. Any other questions? And yeah, so the raw comments, just to point folks out, I think if you go to the MSPP Task Force website and scroll down to the available resources under the October draft recommendations, I apologize. The link seems to be broken, so we will look into that and get it corrected ASAP. So thank you. Thank you, Paul, for letting us know that. We will get that corrected and back up there. So we'll get that fixed. All right. Any other comments? We do still have a few minutes left here before we close out for today's session. All right. Well, then with that, we'll take a little bit of time here to close out. I apologize. So yeah, we've got not a lot of time here, or not a bit of time. So thanks, of course, to everybody who showed up here in Salt Lake, and those of you who participated remotely. Really, really appreciate the dialogue. I know this has given the task force a lot to consider as they go back and develop the final recommendations. As you heard, there is another forum next Wednesday in Atlanta with virtual option as well. And the task force is continuing all the outreach and engagement that it's been doing. So, if you do think of something that you want to provide more clarity on as the day or weeks go on, feel free to, again, directly reach out to any of the task force members or to the MSPP@nerc.net email address, and we'll make sure that feedback gets passed along to the task force. As you've probably heard through some other conversations, the task force is meeting in early December to consider all the feedback and begin refining their final recommendations with the intent to present those to the board in February. And again, I think we've heard the conversation here about if there could be some opportunity for where there might be an opportunity for additional conversation around those. So task force will consider that as they develop the recommendations. And I think with that, I do want to also remind everybody of the new NERC website. Hopefully everybody's had an opportunity to poke around there and finds it a lot easier to navigate. And with that, of course, we've got a new MSPPTF webpage that I think is at least a little bit more organized than the last one. So hopefully you're finding that to be a good experience. We do have a lot of resources there that we continue to post and continue to keep industry updated. We've got information there around upcoming engagements and everything like that. And again, once we get that link fixed, the raw comments will be posted, out there. And then we'll also be looking to post the quantitative data analysis that we went through this morning, those slides, just along with the spreadsheet of comments. So before we really close out, I did just want to turn to any of the task force members if there are any comments anyone would like to make, any key takeaways you all have heard that you all take back to bring to the broader task force in early December.
Yeah, I'll do my best, Lucas, and forward impression. Your engagement is appreciated. Your feedback is a gift, and your continuous ability to give us direction here is very much how this is going to succeed. Thank you.
I would just like to add that the board is really looking forward to seeing this in February, and hopefully you can help us make it the best product that it can be.
All right. Well, if nothing else, just thank you again, everybody. Really, really appreciate the conversation. And we'll look forward to additional conversation in Atlanta next week and keep moving this forward. So I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day. And this concludes today's forum. Thank you.